Hey, welcome back, friend. If you are here right now, curled up somewhere soft, maybe the lights are already low, maybe you've got a blanket pulled up just right, I am really glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Think about the last time you felt truly, genuinely warm. Not just temperature warm, but that kind of deep, bones, settling warmth that makes you feel like the world cannot touch you. Like everything outside can wait. Now, imagine that warmth was not something you could turn on with a switch. Imagine it was something you had to earn every single day with your own two hands. And if you lost it, if you let it slip away even for one careless night, you might not survive the winter. That is where we're going tonight. Back to a time when the fire in your home was not just a comfort. It was everything. If you are enjoying what I bring to you here, it would mean the world to me. If you took just a second, hit that like button, subscribe if you have not yet, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. Are you tucked in bed on the couch? Maybe listening with your eyes already half closed? Tell me. I genuinely love hearing from you. And when you're ready, let the lights go soft. Find a cozy spot. And let tonight's story carry you somewhere far, far away. Let us go back, way back, to a time before central heating, before thermostats, before the quiet hum of a furnace in the basement, doing all the hard work while you sleep. We're talking about medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th century all the way through to the 15th. 1,000 years of cold stone floors, thatched roofs, and wind that found its way through every crack in the wall. And right in the center of every home, whether it was a rough peasant's cottage or a grand manor house, there was a fire. Not a decorative fire, not a fireplace you light on Christmas Eve for the atmosphere, a fire that had to burn, constantly without fail. Here is the thing most of us never think about in a medieval home fire was not just warmth. It was light. It was the only way to cook food. It was the only way to boil water clean enough to drink. It was the thing that kept the frost from creeping into the bones of your children in the night. Fire was life itself compressed into a flickering orange flame, and someone had to tend it. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting and honestly a little heartbreaking. In a typical medieval household, the responsibility of keeping the fire alive fell almost entirely to women, to the wife, to the daughters, to the servant girls if a family was wealthy enough to have them. Historians who have studied medieval household records documents like the 13th century English farming guide called the Fleda, or the beautifully detailed French household manual called Le Ménager de Paris written around the year 1393, describe a domestic life structured almost entirely around the management of fire. The day began at the hearth, and it ended there. A woman in a peasant cottage would wake before her husband, often while it was still dark, to check the state of the fire. This was not optional. This was survival. Because here's what happened if the fire went out overnight. You did not just go turn on the stove. You had to go get fire from somewhere else. And in a medieval village, that meant waking up a neighbor often in the middle of the night or at the break of dawn to beg for a lit coal or a smoldering stick carried home, carefully cupped in your hands or tucked in a small clay pot. There was even a specific tool for this called a curfew from the Old French words couvre, fure, meaning cover the fire. It was a domed metal cover that you placed over the embers at night to slow their burn and protect them until morning. The word curfew, which we now use for laws about when people must be off the streets, it comes directly from this practice of covering the fire at night. Language itself carries the memory of the medieval hearth. Let me paint you a picture. It is a January morning somewhere in rural England sometime in the year 1250. The village is quiet except for wind. There is frost on the inside of the window shutters. Your breath comes out in small clouds. A woman, let us call her Margaret, because that was one of the most common names in medieval England, wakes before everyone else. She moves carefully in the dark, not wanting to wake the children sleeping nearby. She crouches beside the hearth and carefully lifts the curfew cover. She leans in close. The embers are still there, barely. Just a faint red glow under the ash. She exhales slowly because if they had not been there, if she had been a little less careful the night before, if she had not banked the fire just right before sleeping, the entire morning would have been thrown into chaos. No warmth, no breakfast, no hot water to start the day, just cold and the humiliating walk to a neighbor's door. She reaches for a handful of kindling thin sticks she gathered and dried herself the previous autumn, and begins the careful practiced work of coaxing the fire back to life. This is how most medieval mornings began, not with the buzz of an alarm clock, with the quiet, focused attention of a woman and a fire. Now I want to share something that genuinely moved me when I first learned about it. Archaeologists and historians who study medieval hearths have found that in many English manor houses and farmhouses, the central hearth, the main fire pit in the Great Hall, was kept burning continuously for years, sometimes decades. There is a record from Pent Place in Kent, one of the best preserved medieval great halls in England, showing that the hall fire was maintained without significant interruption for generations. The hall was built in the year 1341. The fire in it was as much a part of the household as the family itself. That continuity was not just practical, it was deeply meaningful. Medieval people believed that a fire that had been burning for a long time carried something, a kind of spirit or protection or blessing. To let the fire die was not just inconvenient. It was considered a terrible omen, a sign that something had gone deeply wrong in the household. So, because Alice was among the most common women's names in medieval England, standing in her small yard on a women were not just managing a domestic chore. They were in a very real sense the guardians of the family's survival and its spiritual well-being. No wonder it was taken so seriously. But here is where I want to slow down for a moment, because the mechanics of medieval fire management are genuinely fascinating, and most people have no idea how complex they were. First, the wood. Not all wood burns the same, and medieval people knew this the way we know the difference between a fast food meal and a home-cooked one. Oak burned long and hot, perfect for nighttime baking. Ash was prized because it burns well even when green, meaning freshly cut. Hawthorn and blackthorn burn intensely, but quickly. Applewood smelled wonderful and was saved for special occasions. A woman managing a household fire knew her wood. She had to second the positioning. Medieval hearths, especially in peasant homes, were not against a wall. They were in the center of the room with smoke rising through a hole in the roof or through the thatch itself. This is not a design flaw. It is brilliantly practical. A central fire radiates heat in all directions. A wool fire loses half its warmth immediately, but it also means the smoke fills the room before rising. Medieval cottages were, by our standards, eye-wateringly smoky places to live. Historians have found evidence in the bones of medieval rural workers, particularly women, who spent more time near the hearth of lung conditions consistent with long-term smoke exposure. The warmth came at a cost. It always did. Third, and this is the detail I find most quietly remarkable, the timing. In many medieval households, different tasks were tied to the specific state of the fire. A roaring fire was for boiling. A medium fire was for simmering. Glowing coals were for baking. Bread was often placed in clay pots and buried directly in the embers. A dying fire was for smoking and drying. The woman at the hearth was not just tending a flame. She was, in modern terms, operating a multi-stage cooking system with no temperature controls, no timers, and no margin for error. A batch of bread ruined by an uneven fire meant less food for the week. Porridge burned because the fire flared unexpectedly meant an argument. A hungry family. A morning that felt wrong from the very start. There is a passage in a medieval English agricultural text from the 13th century called the Sentency, a guide for running a great estate that instructs the household staff on fire management in remarkable detail. It specifies exactly how it should be arranged, how fire should be maintained through the night, and who bears responsibility if the fire is mismanaged. The accountability was real. In wealthier households, a servant who let the fire go out could face punishment, loss of wages, or dismissal. In poorer households, the consequences were starker still. A family that lost its fire in January was a family in genuine danger. And I think this is the part of the story that hits differently when you sit with it quietly. We talk sometimes about how hard modern life is, and it is in its own ways the pressure, the pace, the noise of it all. But there is something almost unbearable in its tenderness about the medieval woman who woke before dawn every single morning for years and years. Not because someone told her to, but because she understood in her bones that the fire was her responsibility and her family's safety depended on her getting it right. No recognition, no acknowledgement, no special title, just the fire in the hands that kept it burning. That quiet, invisible work, that is what we are exploring tonight. All the labor that held medieval life together, that no history book gave a chapter to that, no tapestry thought to celebrate. Because here is the truth. Behind every great king, every famous battle, Every magnificent cathedral, there was a hearth. And beside that hearth, there was someone who never let the fire die. Now that we have settled into the warmth of the hearth together, I want to take you even deeper into the hidden world of the medieval home. Because the fire, as extraordinary as it was only the beginning. There was another daily battle happening in those homes. A silent war waged with ash, with cold water, and with bare hands against something that never, ever surrendered. And the weapons medieval people used to fight it, they were stranger, more clever, and honestly more effective than almost anything you would expect. That story is coming up next, and I think it might just change how you look at the things you take for granted in your own home tonight. Some things about cleanliness puzzle me more than almost anything else from the medieval world. Because here's the assumption most of us carry around without even realizing it. We assume that people in the Middle Ages were just dirty, unwashed, unbothered, completely unbothered by the state of their homes. That they lived in filth because they did not know any better. And I want to gently, firmly, and with great enthusiasm dismantle that idea completely, because the truth is so much more interesting. Medieval people cared deeply about cleanliness. They wrote about it. They argued about it. They developed intricate systems to achieve it. Systems that were in some ways more chemically sophisticated than anything we might expect from a world without plumbing. The difference between their cleanliness and ours is not one of desire. It is one of technology. And when you understand what they had to work with, the ingenuity they showed is genuinely remarkable. So, let me take you into the medieval home, past the hearth, past the great hall, and into the quieter, stranger, more intimate work of keeping a house clean. Close your eyes for just a moment and picture a village in the English countryside somewhere around the year 1280. A modest farmhouse, stone walls, a packed earth floor, a family of 5 or 6 people along with probably a dog, possibly a few chickens that wandered in through the open door, and at least one cat who believed the entire house belonged to her. Now, picture the woman of that household. We will call her Alice Spring Morning, looking at a pile of laundry, a floor that needs freshening, and wooden bowls that need scrubbing. She has no soap, not the kind we mean when we say soap. She has no bleach, no antiseptic spray, no scrubbing pads from a store. What she does have, and this is the part that genuinely surprised me when I first read about it, is a sophisticated knowledge of natural chemistry that she learned from her mother, who learned it from hers. And she's going to use every bit of it today. Let us start with the most counterintuitive cleaning agent in the medieval household arsenal: urine. Now, stay with me here because I promise this is going somewhere fascinating. Aged or fermented human urine stored in clay pots and left for several days becomes rich in ammonia. And ammonia, as any modern cleaning product label will tell you, is a genuinely powerful degreaser and stain remover. Medieval laundresses and housewives knew this, even if they would not have used the word ammonia. They called it lye water or chamber lye, and it was collected, stored and used with complete matter-of-fact practicality as a laundry treatment for heavily soiled cloth and wool. This was not desperation. This was craft. Cloth treated with chamber lye and then rinsed thoroughly in running water came out cleaner and softer than cloth washed in plain water alone. The process was common enough that historical records from English and French households mention the collection of chamber lye as a routine domestic task, as unremarkable as collecting eggs. And here's the quietly wonderful part modern chemistry has confirmed what medieval housewives knew through pure observation. The ammonia in aged urine genuinely does break down organic matter, remove grease, and brighten fabric. They were right. They were doing something that worked. They just did not know why. And honestly, they did not need to. But urine was just one tool among many. And I want you to understand how layered, how genuinely systematic the medieval approach to cleaning really was. Take wood ash, the ash from the hearth, which, as we talked about in the last part, was a constant presence in every medieval home, was never simply discarded. It was saved carefully in clay pots or wooden barrels because it was one of the most versatile cleaning substances available. When wood ash is soaked in water, the water absorbs potassium carbonate, a powerful alkaline compound that cuts through grease and grime much the way modern dish soap does. This liquid was called lye, and it formed the basis of medieval cleaning in a way that was absolutely central to the household economy. Lye-soaked water was used to clean floors, to scrub wooden furniture and kitchen implements, to wash walls, to treat animal hides, and when combined with animal fat and boiled for long enough, it became what we would recognize as a primitive soap. So the hearth fire did not just warm the family and cook the food. It ash collected every morning became the cleaning agent that kept the house livable. Every part of medieval domestic life was circular in this way. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a second life. Can I ask you something? When you clean your kitchen counter tonight, if you are not already half asleep, what are you actually using? A spray bottle with ingredients you probably could not name. A sponge that came wrapped in plastic. I'm not saying medieval was better. I am genuinely not. But there is something quietly humbling about the fact that a woman in 13th century England could have explained to you, in precise practical terms, exactly how and why her cleaning agents worked, and where each ingredient came from in a way that most of us today simply cannot. That knowledge was hers and inherited and passed forward. Now, beyond the chemistry of cleaning, there is a whole other dimension of medieval housekeeping that I find absolutely fascinating, and that is the use of plants. Medieval homes were fragrant places, not always pleasantly so by our standards, but the women who ran them were engaged in a constant thoughtful effort to manage the smells, the pests, and the general atmosphere of their spaces using plants in ways that were both practical and genuinely effective. Rushes, the long, flat, stemmed water plants that grow along rivers and ponds, were the primary floor covering in most medieval homes. Before rugs, before wooden floorboards, before tiles in everyday houses, there were rushes spread thick across the floor. They provided insulation, absorbed moisture and food scraps, and were relatively comfortable to walk on barefoot. But here's the clever part. They were not just plain rushes. Historical records, particularly from English manor house accounts dating from the 13th and 14th centuries, show that fresh rushes were often mixed with aromatic herbs before being spread on the floor. Sweet flag, meadow, sweet lavender, rosemary, penny, royal, tansy. These are not simply decorative choices. Meatuite, for instance, contains compounds that act as a mild insect deterrent. Pennyroyal, a small member of the mint family, is a documented natural flea repellent, and fleas were a genuine and constant problem in medieval homes. Lavender repels moths and has mild antibacterial properties. Tansy, when bruised underfoot as people walked across it, released oils that kept flies away from the floor space. The medieval floor was in effect a slow-release herbal system designed to manage pests, reduce odor, and keep the living space tolerable. And the women who laid those floors knew exactly what they were doing. The Goodman of Paris, the same French household guide that scholars know as L'Aumônier de Paris, includes specific instructions on which herbs should be gathered, at which times of year, how they should be dried and stored, and precisely how they should be layered into floor coverings for maximum effect. This was documented knowledge, deliberate, systematic. There is also the question of walls. Stone walls in medieval homes attracted moisture, mold, and a particular kind of ground-level dampness that made lower rooms feel perpetually cold and slightly damp, even in summer. Medieval housewives addressed this with a practice of lime washing the interior walls, applying a coat of slaked lime mixed with water directly onto the stone surface. Lime wash is again something that modern science has looked at and confirmed it is mildly alkaline, genuinely antibacterial, and reflective enough to brighten dark interior spaces by bouncing candle light around the room more effectively. The whitewashed walls you see in illustrations of medieval interiors were not purely aesthetic choices. They were functional. They reduced mold. They made rooms feel less like caves, and they had to be reapplied typically in spring as part of the larger seasonal cleaning that swept through medieval households at the end of winter. Spring cleaning as a concept goes back much further than most people realize, long before it became a vague modern habit. It was a survival necessity. The moment when the household finally attacked the accumulated grime of a winter spent mostly indoors, when rushes were pulled up and burned, walls were washed, bedding was aired, and the home was essentially rebuilt from the inside. It was exhausting, communal, and apparently, if you read the few descriptions we have of it, something women approach with genuine satisfaction, because a clean home in spring meant a safer, healthier summer. It was not tidiness for its own sake. It was medicine. Here is the part of this story I keep returning to in my own mind. We live in a world that has largely handed cleaning over to products and machines. And those things are genuinely useful, genuinely time-saving, genuinely good. I am not romanticizing scrubbing a floor by hand, but what strikes me every time I read about this is how much thinking went into medieval housekeeping, how much observation, how much accumulated wisdom passed from woman to woman across generations, tested every single day against real consequences. A medieval housewife who failed to manage her home's cleanliness was not just dealing with the discomfort of a messy house. She was managing the risk of disease of food, spoilage of infestations that could destroy stored grain of moisture that could rot the structural timbers her family slept under. The stakes were real, and the knowledge she carried was the answer to those stakes. When historians describe the work of medieval women as domestic labor, I think that phrase flattens something that deserves more. It was applied science. It was household medicine. It was systems management. And it was done every day in silence by women whose names we mostly do not know. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move on. Among the herbs most commonly mentioned in medieval English household records, as both a floor-strewing herb and a cleaning aid, is a plant called wormwood. Wormwood, bitter, silver-leafed aromatic, was a known insect deterrent used around food stores, beds, and floor coverings. Medieval women who used it had probably no idea that its active compound, called the joan, is the same substance that gives absinthe its distinctive character. They just knew that where wormwood grew, pests were fewer. Where it was laid on the floor, the bugs kept their distance. Centuries later, scientists would study that compound in laboratories and give it a Latin name and write papers about its mechanisms. But the medieval woman who bent down to cut wormwood from her garden, who bundled it and spread it carefully around her children's sleeping corner, who learned this from watching her mother do the same, she already knew. She had always known. Cleaning, it turns out, was never simple. It was never mindless. And in the medieval world, it was never done. But if the work of keeping a home clean was relentless, the work of keeping a family fed was something else entirely. Something that required a different kind of genius, a different kind of patience, and a relationship with time and seasons that most of us have completely lost. Because medieval families did not just cook, they planned, preserved, calculated, and prepared months in advance for the possibility that the wrong winter could leave them with nothing. And the methods they used to make food last a stranger, smarter, and more quietly brilliant than almost anything you might imagine. Picture this for a moment. It is a warm August afternoon somewhere in rural France around the year 1290. The harvest is coming in. The air smells of cut hay and warm earth. Children are running between the rows of the kitchen garden, and a woman, sun-darkened, quick-handed, sharp-eyed, is standing over a wooden table covered in pork. She is not cooking it. She is not going to cook it today, or this week, or even this month. She is saving it for January. And what she is doing with her hands right now, the slow, deliberate work of pressing coarse gray salt into every surface of that meat, working it into the joints and folds, packing it into a ceramic crock that will sit in the coolest corner of her cellar for the next 5 months, is one of the most important acts of survival her family will experience all year. If she gets it right, they eat in winter. If she gets it wrong, the meat spoils and there is no going to the store. There is no backup plan. This is the story of how medieval families kept food alive, and in doing so kept themselves alive through methods so precise, so carefully observed, and so quietly brilliant that it genuinely stops me in my tracks every time I think about it. Salt. Let's start there, because salt is where almost every medieval preservation story begins. We toss it in a pasta water without thinking. We have little ceramic pinch pots of it sitting decoratively on our kitchen counters. It costs almost nothing, and we use it so casually that it barely registers as anything significant. In medieval Europe, salt was one of the most valuable commodities that existed. Historians who study medieval trade records, particularly the detailed accounts from English royal household accounts of the 13th and 14th centuries, consistently show salt appearing alongside spices and imported cloth as a major expenditure. Salt taxes existed across France, Germany, and England. Wars were fought over salt routes. Entire economies were built around salt mines and salt marshes. The word salary, the money you earn for your work, comes from the Latin word for salt, salarium, because Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt or given an allowance specifically to buy it. Salt was money. Salt was power. And in the medieval kitchen, Salt was the difference between eating and starving. The science of salting meat, which medieval housewives understood through generations of observation rather than any formal theory, is actually quite elegant. Salt pulls moisture out of meat through a process that scientists now call osmosis. When meat loses its moisture, the bacteria that would normally cause it to decompose cannot survive. The meat does not rot. It simply waits. Dry salting, rubbing salt directly into the meat, was used for thick cuts like pork legs and beef haunches. Brine, curing, submerging the meat in heavily salted water, worked better for smaller pieces and poultry. Both methods required constant attention, regular turning of the meat, and careful checking for any sign that the brine had weakened or the salt had not penetrated evenly. A batch of improperly salted pork was not just a waste. It was a catastrophe. And yet, medieval households managed this process without thermometers, without standardized salt concentrations, without any written recipe they could follow precisely. They used their senses, the firmness of the meat, the smell, the color, the way it felt under the fingers to judge whether a cure was working. That is expertise, the kind that cannot be learned from a book. But salt was not the only tool in the medieval preservation pantry. And I want to take you further in, because this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Honey, pure medieval honey. And there was a great deal of it because beekeeping was one of the most systematically practiced arts of the medieval household. It is one of nature's most extraordinary preservatives. Its low moisture content and natural acidity create an environment where almost nothing harmful can survive for long. Medieval households used honey to preserve fruit. Whole plums, pears, and quinces packed in a crocks of honey would keep for a year or more. They used it to coat certain meats. They used it to preserve medicinal herbs and roots. There is a 12th century English manuscript part of a collection of household and medical writings that historians refer to as the Lac Nunga traditions that describes methods of packing medicinal roots and berries in honey for long-term storage, specifically so that remedies would be available in winter when the plants themselves could not be found. The people who wrote that were not thinking in terms of chemistry. They were thinking in terms of experience. They knew that things kept in honey lasted longer. They knew it because they had tried it, and their mothers had tried it, and their grandmothers before them. They were right about the science, even though they did not know what the science was. Can I tell you about something that I find absolutely wonderful fat? Specifically, the medieval technique called confit, from the French word meaning to preserve, which involves cooking meat slowly in its own rendered fat, and then sealing it completely submerged in that same fat inside a ceramic pot. Duck confit, goose confit, pork roulettes. These are things that appear on the menus of fine restaurants today, described in careful, expensive terms, presented as delicacies. They started as survival food. The fat created an airtight seal over the meat, cutting off all contact with the air that bacteria need to survive. A properly made confit cellar could keep the meat edible for months, sometimes right through a full winter and into the following spring. This technique appears in French household records from as early as the 13th century, and there is strong evidence that similar fat sealing methods were used across England and Germany for both meat and certain types of fish. What I find remarkable is not just that it worked. It is that someone at some point in the medieval past figured out that if you surrounded food completely with fat and kept it cool and undisturbed, it would last. Not because they read it in a book, but because they watched and tried and watched again across years and years of hungry winters. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Where did all this preserved food actually go? Because keeping food safe required not just preparation. It required architecture, the root cellar. Medieval homes, even relatively modest ones in England and France, were frequently built with underground storage spaces or had access to communal underground cellars in the village structure. These spaces were not accidental. They were engineered with a sophisticated understanding of temperature and humidity, even if medieval builders would not have used either of those words. Underground, the temperature stays relatively constant, cool in summer, warmer than the surface in winter. Humidity levels remain moderate. These are exactly the conditions that slow the spoilage of vegetables, preserve the integrity of salt cures, and keep earthenware crocks of preserved fruit from either freezing or overheating. Archaeological excavations of medieval village sites across England, including detailed work done at the deserted medieval village of Warren Percy in Yorkshire, one of the most studied medieval sites in the world, have uncovered the remains of these storage structures alongside the houses they served. They were not afterthoughts. They were central to the design. The medieval home was in part a preservation machine. Every room, every corner, every underground space had a role to play in the larger project of keeping a family fed through a season that could easily kill them if they were not prepared. I want to pause here and tell you about something that genuinely changed the way I think about medieval food culture. Vinegar. We know vinegar today mostly as a salad dressing ingredient or something you use to clean your coffee maker. In medieval Europe, vinegar, particularly the sharp, locally produced grape or apple vinegar that every household with orchard or vine access would have made, was one of the primary preservation acids available to ordinary people. Vegetables pickled in vinegar could last through the winter. Onions, turnips, cabbage, and particularly the small cucumbers that appear regularly in medieval English garden records were routinely preserved this way. But here is the detail that most people miss entirely. Medieval vinegar was also used to preserve eggs. Whole raw eggs submerged in diluted vinegar could be kept edible for several weeks beyond their normal shelf life. A genuinely significant advantage in a world where chickens stop laying reliably in the cold months and fresh eggs might not be available again until spring. There are references to this technique in several medieval household texts, including instructions in German domestic manuscript from the 14th century that describe egg preservation with the kind of precise no-nonsense language that tells you this was everyday practice, not exotic technique. Vinegar was also used, and this is the part one find quietly poetic, to preserve flowers. Rose petals and violets packed in vinegar were used both as food flavoring and as a form of household luxury, something beautiful saved from summer and opened carefully in the gray months of February when the garden was bare and color was hard to come by. Even preservation in the medieval home had room for beauty. Let us talk about spices for a moment, because no conversation about medieval food preservation is complete without them. And here I want to push back a little against the most common explanation you hear, which is that medieval people used spices simply to cover the taste of spoiled meat. That is not quite right, and it sells medieval people significantly short. The spice trade in medieval Europe, the long, dangerous, enormously expensive routes that brought pepper from India cloves from what we now call Indonesia cinnamon from Sri Lanka and other parts of South and Southeast Asia, was not driven by people trying to disguise bad food. Spices were too precious for that. Far too precious. Pepper in the 12th and 13th centuries was valuable enough that it appeared in wills and legal documents as a bequeathable asset. A pound of nutmeg, a pound, was worth roughly the same as several sheep in some English markets of the 14th century. You did not waste that on rotten meat. What spices actually did, and what medieval people understood again through observation rather than formal science, was slow the growth of the microorganisms that caused food to deteriorate. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper all contain antimicrobial compounds. They genuinely do extend the edible life of food when used in sufficient quantities. Medieval people used spices in preservation because they worked. The wealthy household that could afford to heavily spice its preserved meats and fruit conserves was not being extravagant. It was being strategic. The spice trade was in part a food safety industry. And then there is the calendar. Because the most remarkable thing about medieval food preservation, the thing that I think we've almost completely lost in the modern world, is how deeply it was governed by time. Not the time on a clock, the time of a year. Every month had its tasks. Pigs were slaughtered in November and December when the cold air acted as natural refrigeration, and the animals had eaten their fill of autumn fodder. Vegetables were salted or dried in late summer. Fish was smoked or salted when the autumn herring runs came in. Dairy butter cheese was made intensively in spring and early summer when the cows were freshest, and preserved in salt for the months when milk would be scarce. Medieval farming guides, particularly the incredibly detailed 13th century English text, known as the Fleet, and the calendar-based sections of the Cino's C, describe this rhythm with the precision of a military timetable. Each season had its window. Miss the window, and you missed your chance until next year. A family that failed to salt enough pork in November did not simply have less meat in February. They might have none. A household that did not dry and store enough dried herbs and pulse vegetables before the first frost might find themselves eating plain grain porridge every day from January through April with nothing to vary it. Nothing to make it nourishing enough for children. Nothing to give the flavors that made survival feel, however briefly, like something more than just getting through. The medieval housewife who managed these calendars in her head, who kept track simultaneously of what was curing in the cellar, what was drying by the fire, what needed to be checked for spoilage, and what needed to be started immediately before the weather turned, was running an operation of genuine complexity, without a spreadsheet, without a phone reminder, without anything except knowledge, attention, and the deep understanding that her family's survival ran through her hands. There's something I come back to often when I think about all of this. We live in a world of extraordinary abundance. Most of us in the modern West can walk into a brightly lit store at almost any hour and find food from every season, every climate, every corner of the planet preserved with technologies that would have seemed like pure magic to a medieval housewife. And yet there's kind of knowledge that we've traded away in exchange for that abundance. The intimate embodied understanding of how food works, how it spoils, how it keeps, how long it lasts, and why. How to read its signs with your nose and your fingers and your eyes. That knowledge lived in medieval women's hands and was passed forward through generations, and then gradually over the course of the last century, mostly disappeared. I'm not saying we should go back. Please do not hear that. But I do think there is something worth honoring in the quiet genius of a woman who could look at a piece of salted pork in a November cellar and know from its smell and its color, and the way the brine had settled exactly whether it would make it to March. She knew something real, something true, something that kept people alive. We have moved through fire, through the invisible science of cleaning, and now through the extraordinary ingenuity of keeping food alive through the darkest months. But there is something we have not yet talked about. Something so basic, so daily, so completely woven into the fabric of medieval life that it almost disappears into the background. Water. Not the water that comes out of your tap without you thinking about it. Water that had to be found, carried, stored, judged for safety, and used with extraordinary care every single day. And the story of how medieval households managed water, who carried it, how far they walked, and what happened when the source ran dry or turned dangerous is one of the most quietly moving stories in all of medieval domestic life. That is where we are going next. Right now, wherever you are, bedroom, couch, maybe curled up in a chair with the lights turned low, there is clean water within arm's reach of you. You probably have not thought about that once today. A tap, a glass, a bottle on the nightstand. Water so available, so reliable, so utterly unremarkable that it has become part of the invisible furniture of your life. I want to ask you to hold that thought for just a moment, because what we're about to explore is a world in which that invisible thing, that thing you never think about, was the first task of every single morning. A task that could take hours. A task that shaped the bodies of the people who did it to determine the health of every child in the household and quietly governed almost every other form of domestic work we've talked about so far. Water in the medieval world did not arrive. It had to be found, carried, judged, stored, and used with a carefulness that we've completely, utterly lost. Let's start with the simplest question. Where did it come from? For most medieval families living in rural villages across England, France, and the German-speaking lands, the answer was one of three places: a river or stream, a natural spring, or a well, either communal, shared by the whole village, or occasionally private, belonging to a manor or monastery. Each of these sources had its own character, its own seasonal rhythms, and its own particular dangers. Rivers and streams were often the most accessible, and in many villages, the most heavily used, but river water was also the most vulnerable to contamination. Livestock drank from the same stretches where women filled their buckets. Mills discharged debris into the water. Villages upstream from yours treated the river as a convenient place to dispose of waste. Medieval people were not ignorant of this. There is a persistent modern myth that people in the Middle Ages drank nothing but ale because the water was too foul to consume. This is an exaggeration and a fairly lazy one if I'm being honest. Medieval medical texts, including the influential writings of the 12th century scholar Hildegard of Bingen, discuss, at considerable length, which water sources were considered healthy and which were not, and advised strongly against drinking from slow-moving or stagnant water near settlements. They did not have germ theory, but they had centuries of accumulated observation that told them clearly and accurately that some water made you sick and some did not. That is not ignorance. That is practical epidemiology. The well was a different matter entirely. In a village that had a good well, one that drew from a deep, clean aquifer fed by underground water that had been naturally filtered through layers of rock and earth, the well was nothing less than a community treasure. Medieval village records, including the beautifully preserved manor rolls from various English estates dating from the 13th and 14th centuries, contain multiple references to legal disputes over well access and well maintenance. Who had the right to use it? Who was responsible for keeping the surrounding area clean? What penalty it applied to anyone who contaminated or damaged the structure? These were serious matters. In the village of Elton in Huntingdonshire, one of the medieval communities most thoroughly documented by the historian George Casterham Mans in his studies of medieval English village life court records, show multiple cases brought against individuals who allowed their animals to foul the communal water source or who drew water in ways that damaged the well casing. The community protected its water with the full weight of the local law because they understood in their bones what a contaminated well meant. It meant sick children. It meant a summer of illness spreading through a village that had no way to stop it once it started. But here's the part of the water story that I want you to really sit with, because it is the part that most directly shaped the daily lives of medieval women and children. The carrying. A typical medieval household, a peasant family, a craftsman's family, even a moderately prosperous farming family needed somewhere between 10 and 15 gallons of water per day for basic domestic purposes. Cooking, cleaning, laundry on laundry days, watering the kitchen garden, providing drink for household animals kept close to the home. A gallon of water weighs just over 8 pounds. 10 gallons, 80 pounds. Now, imagine walking to a well or a stream. Not a short walk down a modern street, but often a walk of a quarter mile, half a mile, sometimes further, depending on the village layout and the season, filling a heavy ceramic or wooden vessel, lifting it and carrying it back, and then doing it again and again. Medieval water vessels, the earthenware jugs, the wooden buckets bound with iron hoops, the large ceramic pitchers documented in household inventories from English and French estates, typically held between 2 and 4 gall each, which means a woman providing 10 gall of water for her household's daily needs, was making multiple trips, carrying between 16 and 32 pounds of water each time, across a distance that added up over the course of a day to something genuinely significant. Archaeologists and physical anthropologists who've studied skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries across England, including detailed analyses from sites in York, London, and rural Lincolnshire, have found consistent evidence of spinal compression and shoulder joint, wherein female remains consistent with years of carrying heavy loads at shoulder height. The medieval woman's body carried the evidence of the water she fetched. You know, when I first came across that skeletal evidence, I had to put down what I was reading and just think for a moment. We talk about historical women as if they existed somehow outside of physical reality as figures in tapestries, subjects of portraits, names, and church records. But their bodies were real. Their muscles acted. Their shoulders grew strong and then wore out. The work they did left marks in their very bones that archaeologists can read 800 years later. That is not abstract history. That is a human being who carried water every day of her adult life until her skeleton recorded it permanently. I find that deeply moving, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. Now, not everyone was carrying their own water, and this is where the story of medieval water becomes a story about social class, which in the medieval world shaped almost everything. In a wealthy household, a large manor and episcopal palace, a prosperous merchant's townhouse, water was managed by servants and sometimes by quite sophisticated infrastructure. Several large English monasteries and some wealthier secular estates had developed what historians call conduit systems by the 12th and 13th centuries, networks of lead pipes or hollowed wooden channels that brought water from a higher source, a spring on higher ground, a diverted stream directly into the kitchen or the yard using nothing but gravity. Canterbury Cathedral Priory, one of the great monastic establishments of medieval England, had a remarkably elaborate water system. By the mid-12th century, documented in a famous illuminated plan that still survives, it shows a network of pipes bringing fresh spring water into the kitchen, the infirmary, the lavatories, and the central washing area. an achievement that the monks clearly regarded with considerable pride, and they should have. It was genuinely impressive engineering for its time. But here is the important thing. That kind of infrastructure was the exception, not the rule. For the overwhelming majority of medieval people, the peasants, the artisans, the smallholders, the urban poor living in the crowded back streets of medieval towns, water came from the same place it always had. A well, a stream, and two strong arms willing to carry it home. Let me take you into a medieval town for a moment, because the water situation in urban medieval life was its own particular story. Towns like London, Paris, and Cologne, which were by medieval standards genuinely large and densely populated, faced a water problem of a completely different scale from the rural village. Thousands of people, limited clean sources, and a tendency as populations grew for the cleaner water sources to become steadily more compromised. London's response, and this is one of those medieval civic achievements that almost nobody knows about, was the Great Conduit of Cheapside, constructed in the year 1237 under the reign of Henry III. This was a lead pipe system that brought water from the cleaner springs at Tyburn, in what is now the area around Marble Arch in the West End, all the way into the heart of the city to a series of public systems where Londoners could come to fill their vessels. Water carriers, men and women who made their living fetching water from the conduits and delivering it to households that could pay, became a recognized trade in medieval London. They appear in guild records. They charge for their services. They were in their own modest way part of the city's essential workforce. Water had a price. Water had a market. Water had its own economy. And the households that could not afford to pay a water carrier, or who lived too far from any conduit to make use of it, fell back on the river. The Thames, which by the 14th century was already carrying a significant load of waste from the city's tanneries, slaughterhouses, and general population. The gap between those who had access to clean water and those who did not was in medieval towns a gap between health and illness, between a childhood survived and one cut short. Water quality was not left entirely to chance, though. And this is another area where medieval domestic knowledge surprises me every time I revisit it. In the absence of any ability to test water chemically, medieval households developed a range of practical methods for assessing and improving the water they had. Settling was the simplest. Water carried from a river or questionable well was often left to stand in a large vessel for several hours before use, allowing sediment and heavier particles to sink to the bottom. The clearer water drawn from the top was meaningfully cleaner than what had been collected. Boiling was used, but not universally, partly because fuel was never free, and boiling a large quantity of water represented a real expenditure of the wood or peat that the family depended on. The common understanding that boiling water made it safer was present in medieval medical thinking, though it was framed in terms of the water being purified or corrected rather than in any language we would recognize as germ theory. There is also evidence from German and Flemish household sources of the 14th and 15th centuries of the use of silver vessels for water storage in wealthier households, with the explicit understanding that water stored in silver kept better and was less likely to cause illness. They were right again, without knowing precisely why silver does have genuine antimicrobial properties, something that modern research has thoroughly confirmed. Even the choice of vessel mattered. Earthenware, the most common material for water. Storage was porous, which actually helped keep water cool through gentle evaporation, much like a modern terracotta pot. But it also meant that if a vessel had ever held anything contaminated, that contamination could persist in the clay itself. Medieval housewives who noticed that water stored in a particular pot made family members ill were responding to something real, even if they lacked the language to explain it. What strikes me most about all of this, and I keep returning to this thought, is how much of medieval water management was really a form of constant low-level risk assessment. Every time a medieval woman drew water, she was making a judgment. Is this source safe today? Has the river run cloudy from upstream rain, which might mean animal waste is washed in? Does this well smell different than usual? Is the water from this bucket clear enough for the baby, or only clean enough for washing? These judgments happen dozens of times a week automatically without fanfare as part of the background hum of keeping a family alive. We do not make those judgments. We turn on the tap and trust rightly that an enormous infrastructure of pipes and treatment plants and public health regulations is making those judgments on our behalf, which is a miracle. a genuine, underappreciated, everyday miracle. But it also means we've lost something. Not just the physical skill, but the quality of attention, the habit of noticing, the quiet alertness to the world around you that medieval life demanded as a basic condition of survival. Water, it turned out, was never just water in the medieval world. It was time the hours spent fetching it. It was labor the weight carried in the bones. It was community, the well where the village met, argued, gossiped, and kept watch over one another. It was status, the conduit pipe that ran into the wealthy kitchen versus the long walk to the river that fell to everyone else. And it was knowledge, the embodied, inherited, daily renewed knowledge of how to find it, judge it, carry it, store it, and use it wisely enough that the people drinking it would still be alive in the morning. That is not a small thing. That was never a small thing. We have followed the water from the well to the door, from the river to the pot, from the conduit of a great city to the hands of a woman who carried it home. But once water was inside the medieval home, it set in motion another kind of work, one that ran on an entirely different time scale. Not daily, but seasonal, not hours, but weeks. Because medieval families did not just fetch thread from a store any more than they fetched water from a tap. The cloth on their backs, the warmth around their children at night, the very fabric of their domestic lives. They made it with their hands, with tools so simple they fit in a pocket. And the story of how medieval women turned raw fiber into cloth, and what that work really cost them in time, in attention, in the years of their lives, is a story that will genuinely change the way you look at the clothes you're wearing right now. There's something sitting right next to you tonight, or on you more likely that you have almost certainly never thought twice about the fabric of your clothes. Whatever you're wearing right now, a soft shirt, pajamas, a warm hoodie, started as a raw fiber somewhere. It was processed, spun, woven, or knitted, cut sewn. Machines did most of that work in a matter of minutes. Enormous factories, automated looms, industrial thread production measured in miles per hour. You put on, you forgot about it. Now, I want to tell you what that same process looked like in a medieval household. Not in a factory, not with machines, but in a small room, by firelight with two hands and a stick. Because the story of how medieval families clothed themselves is one of the most quietly staggering stories of human labor I have ever encountered. And when I tell you the numbers, the real documented historical numbers of how long it actually took, I think you will feel it too. Let us start at the very beginning. Wool. In medieval England, France, and the German-speaking lands, wool was the foundation of ordinary clothing. Sheep were kept on almost every farm of any size, and their fleece sheared once a year. Typically in late spring was the raw material from which most everyday cloth began its long journey toward becoming something wearable. But raw fleece straight off the sheep is nothing like the soft material you might imagine. It is linoline heavy, which means greasy, and slightly waxy to the touch. It is full of vegetable matter seeds, bits of hay, dried grass picked up from months of grazing. It may contain dried mud debris and the general accumulated residue of a sheep's outdoor life. Before a single thread could be spun, the fleece had to be cleaned, dried, and painstakingly picked apart by hand to remove every piece of foreign matter. Then it had to be carded, drawn repeatedly through paddle-like tools set with fine metal or thorn points called cards to align the fibers, so they could be spun smoothly. This preparatory work alone for a single fleece could take hours, and that was before anyone had spun a single inch of thread, spinning itself. The process of drawing out the aligned fibers and twisting them together into a continuous thread strong enough to weave was done for most of the medieval period with a hand spindle, not a spinning wheel. That came later filtering into European use gradually from around the 13th century onward, and even then spreading slowly and unevenly. For much of the early and central medieval period, the tool was a simple drop spindle, a weighted wooden stick perhaps 10 in long with a whorl, a small disc of wood bone or clay near the bottom to add momentum as it spun. This spinner held her fiber supply, the prepared fleece, or the dress flax on her long forked stick called a daff tucked under her left arm or held in her left hand. With her right hand, she drew out a length of fiber, attached it to the spindle, gave the spindle a twist to set it spinning, and then let it drop its own weight, pulling the thread downward and taut as its rotation twisted the fibers together. She caught it before it hit the ground, wound the New thread onto the spindle shaft, drew out more fiber, twisted again, let it drop over and over for hours every day. I want you to really understand the scale of this, because the numbers are almost difficult to believe when you first encounter them. Medieval textile historians, scholars who have studied the production records of English wool merchants, Flemish weaving guilds, and Italian cloth manufacturers from the 13th and 14th centuries, have calculated that producing enough thread to weave a single yard of basic woolen cloth required somewhere between 6 and 12 hours of spinning time, depending on the thinness of the thread and the skill of the spinner. A basic tunic for an adult man required approximately 3 to 4 yards of cloth. A simple household blanket required 4 to 6 yards. A woman's dress, depending on style and social rank, could require 5 to 8 yards or more. Do the arithmetic, and you begin to understand something important. Clothing a medieval family, and even the most basic garments required hundreds of hours of spinning per year. Hundreds, from a single household, and that does not include weaving, which came after. Medieval economic historians, including those who have analyzed the detailed cloth production records of the great Flemish weaving cities like Ghent and Bruges, estimate that for every one weaver producing finished cloth, there were somewhere between 5 and 10 spinners supplying thread. 5 to 10 people spinning full-time to keep one loom running. In a peasant household that had no professional weaver and no purchased cloth, which described the vast majority of medieval rural families, all of that work fell to the women and girls of the house. This is the detail that truly stopped me when I first understood it. The duff and spindle were not just tools. They were carried everywhere. Medieval illustrations, illuminated manuscripts, calendar pages, marginalia and religious texts dating from the 11th through the 15th centuries show women spinning while walking, spinning while supervising children, spinning while talking to neighbors across a fence, spinning while sitting in a cart on a journey. There are depictions in French and English manuscripts of women spinning at church during feast days, during conversations with merchants and neighbors. The spindle was never put down if it could be helped, because every moment of idle hands was a moment of thread not made. And thread not made was cloth not woven. And cloth not woven was a family insufficiently dressed against a winter that did not care about anyone's exhaustion. This is, I think, one of the most human details in all of medieval history. The image of a woman walking across a field or sitting in conversation, hands moving automatically at her side, the spindle turning the thread growing. It tells you something about what it meant to live in that world. There was no separating work from life. Work was woven into every moment, quite literally. Have you ever learned to do something so thoroughly that your hands can do it while your mind is somewhere else entirely? Knitting maybe, or driving a familiar route, or chopping vegetables you've prepared 1,000 times. That is what spinning was for medieval women. So deeply practiced that it became automatic, so essential that it never fully stopped. And here's a word that carries that history inside it right to this day. Spinster. Today we use spinster to mean an unmarried woman, often with an undertone of judgment or pity. But its original meaning, its literal medieval meaning, was simply a woman who spins. That was the word for it, a female spinner. Because spinning was so thoroughly and so universally the work of women that the occupation became the designation, and to staff the forked stick that held the fiber gave us another word that has quietly survived into modern English. When genealogists speak of the distaff side of a family, they mean the maternal line, the mother's side, the women's side. The tools of medieval textile work are embedded in our language. We speak their names without knowing it. Let me take you into the weaving room now, or more accurately, the corner of the main room that served as a weaving space. Because in most medieval households, a dedicated room was a luxury that did not exist. The loom. Medieval looms came in several forms, but the most common for household cloth production was the horizontal trio loom. A large wooden frame, typically around 4 to 6 feet wide, through which warp threads ran lengthwise held under tension, while the weaver passed the weft thread back and forth through them using a shuttle. Operating even a basic trio loom required coordination feet working the treels that raised and lowered alternating sets of warp threads. Hands throwing the shuttle, a third motion, beating each new row of weft firmly into place with a heavy wooden tool called a beater. Learning to weave took years. Setting up a loom, threading each warp thread individually through the heddles and reed, which on a loom of moderate width could mean threading several thousand individual threads, could take a full day before a single row of cloth was woven, and the cloth itself came slowly. An experienced medieval weaver working a horizontal loom could produce roughly 1 yard of basic fabric per hour under good conditions. 1 yard per hour. There's a reason cloth was valuable. There is a reason a length of quality woolen fabric appeared in medieval wills alongside silver and land as a significant bequeathable asset. There is a reason sumpter laws governing what fabrics different social classes were permitted to wear were passed across Europe throughout the medieval period. Cloth represented time. Enormous, irreplaceable human time. Every inch of it. I want to tell you about a particular kind of cloth that I find endlessly fascinating because it connects the world of medieval domestic textile work to something surprisingly modern. Linen. While wool dominated the outer garments of medieval life, the tunics, the cloaks, the blankets, linen made from the fibers of the flax plant was the fabric closest to the body. Undergarments, bed sheets, wimples, baby wrappings. These were linen. And the process of making linen from flax was, if anything, even more labor-intensive than wool production. Flax had to be pulled from the ground at precisely the right moment of its growth cycle too early, and the fibers were underdeveloped too late, and they became too coarse. Then it was soaked for days in water, a process called retting to begin breaking down the woody outer stem. Then it was dried, beaten with a heavy wooden implement to break the stem further, then scraped with a tool called a scotching board to remove the waste material, then combed through fine T hackles to separate and align the long, silky inner fibers. Only then, after all of that, could flax be spun into linen thread. Medieval agricultural calendars, including the beautifully illustrated Flemish calendar manuscripts from the early 15th century that are now among the most studied sources in medieval art history, show the writing and scutching of flax as autumn tasks, major seasonal events in the domestic agricultural year. Listed alongside the grain harvest and the pig slaughter in terms of their importance to the household, linen was not bought. Linen was built from the ground up by hand. There is one more dimension of medieval textile work that I want to bring into this before we move on, because it is the dimension that most directly intersects with the emotional life of the household. Mending. New cloth was expensive. New cloth was time. And medieval clothing was worn until it simply could not be worn any further. And then the pieces that remained were repurposed into something else. Patches on patches, garments let out and taken in as children grew. Seams were sewn, so many times the fabric around them grew thin with needle holes. Medieval needle cases, small decorative containers for the needles that were considered valuable enough to need protection, have been found in archaeological excavations across England and Northern Europe, often in domestic contexts alongside other small household tools. The needle was not a disposable item. It was a tool you kept maintained and mourned if you lost. Household inventories from English medieval estates, particularly those compiled for probate purposes in the 13th and 14th centuries, frequently list needles and thread alongside cooking vessels and agricultural tools in their accounting of household value. A household needle was worth recording, worth inheriting, worth noting, and the mending that depended on that needle, the quiet, patient, endless work of keeping clothing functional for just a little longer, just one more season, was woven into the evenings of medieval domestic life. The way we might scroll through something on a screen tonight. It was the thing you did when the day's harder work was done and your hands still needed to be doing something. Sitting by the fire, mending, letting the mind rest while the fingers worked. I find that oddly comforting. Actually, some things do not change as much as we think. Clothing a family in the medieval world was not a shopping trip. It was year-round occupation measured in hours that added up to something close to a second full-time job layered onto every other task we've already talked about. The fire, the cleaning, the preserving, the water, and now the endless, never-finished work of keeping a family dressed. And yet the medieval home asked for more still. Because when the people in that home fell ill, and in a world without hospitals, without pharmacies, without ambulances, where did they turn? They turned inward to the woman of the house, to her garden, her knowledge, her memory of what her mother had done and her grandmother before her. The medieval home was not just a place to sleep and eat. It was when it needed to be a place of healing. And what medieval women knew about medicine, the plants they grew, the remedies they prepared, The quiet expertise they carried is a story that is equal parts fascinating, heartbreaking, and genuinely ahead of its time. That is exactly where we're headed next. Somewhere in England in the year 1280, a child woke in the night with a burning fever. There was no doctor to call. The nearest physician, a formerly trained man who had studied at a university in Paris or Bologna, was in the closest market town, perhaps a day's walk away, and his fees were beyond what most families could consider. The nearest monastery infirmary, with its trained monks and its small library of medical texts, was equally out of reach. There was only the mother. She got up. She went to the place where she kept her dried herbs, the bundles hanging from the rafters, the small clay pots sealed with cloth on the shelf near the fire, the linen bags of roots and bark stored in the cool corner. She worked by firelight from memory, from knowledge given to her by her own mother and hers before that, and she began to treat her child. This was not unusual. This was not exceptional. This was simply what happened in medieval households when illness arrived, which it did with frightening regularity in a world without antibiotics, without germ theory, without any of the medical infrastructure that most of us have learned to take completely for granted. The woman of the medieval household was by default and by necessity its physician. And what she really knew in the practical, embodied, tested sense of that word was considerably more than most people today give her credit for. Let us start with the physic garden. Behind or beside nearly every medieval home of any resource, from the modest farm wife's cottage to the wealthy manor, there was a deliberate, carefully maintained garden of medicinal plants. Historians and archaeologists studying medieval domestic sites across England, France and Germany have found consistent evidence of these spaces. Small enclosed plots often positioned to catch maximum sunlight, planted with a recognizable selection of species that appear again and again in medieval household records. These were not decorative gardens. They were not grown for pleasure, though some of the plants were beautiful. They were medicine cabinets, living ones, the plants that appear most reliably in both archaeological records and in the household sections of medieval medical texts, particularly the extraordinary 12th century compilation known as Bolt's Leech Book. One of the oldest surviving English-language medical texts, written in the 9th century and copied through the medieval period, include plants whose medicinal properties modern science has spent considerable effort studying and in many cases confirming feverfew. Its name tells you exactly what medieval people used it for. The plant contains a compound called pathnolide, which modern research has shown does genuinely reduce inflammation and has real effects on fever and headache. Medieval women who gathered feverfew leaves and prepared them as a strong tea for a feverish child were giving that child something that worked. Yarrow, one of the most widely documented wound herbs in medieval English and continental medical texts. Yarrow was applied directly to cuts and wounds to slow bleeding and reduce the risk of subsequent infection. It contains compounds that promote blood clotting and have genuine antibacterial properties. Again, it worked. The women who used it did not need a laboratory to tell them so. They had the evidence of wounds that closed cleanly and wounds that did not. Elderberry used across medieval Europe for respiratory illness, for fever, for general immune support. Modern pharmaceutical researchers have published studies on elderberry extracts and their effects on common viral infections. Medieval women were ahead of that curve by roughly 700 years. I find it genuinely moving and a little frustrating on behalf of those women that we spent so long dismissing this knowledge as superstition, only to spend the last century slowly rediscovering that much of it was sound. But the physic garden was only part of the picture. And here's where the story gets genuinely layered. Medieval domestic medicine was not random. It was not simply try this plant and hope for the best. It was organized, not always correctly by modern standards, and sometimes quite wrongly, but organized around coherent systems of understanding that gave medieval practitioners a framework for making decisions. The dominant medical theory of the medieval period was the humoral system inherited from ancient Greek medicine and transmitted through Arabic scholarship into medieval European thought. According to this system, the human body contained 4 fundamental substances: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced illness. Each humor was associated with qualities hot, cold, wet, dry. Each illness was understood as an excess or deficiency of one of these qualities, and treatments were selected to counterbalance the problem. If an illness was characterized as cold and wet, a warming and drying remedy was indicated. Now, we know today that this theoretical framework was incorrect. The humors do not exist in the way medieval physicians imagined them. But here's the thing I want you to sit with. Working within that framework, medieval practitioners made many choices that happened to be right. Not because the theory was correct, but because careful observation of what actually worked had built up over generations, and the theory was then applied to explain the observations rather than to generate them. Fever few reduces fever. Medieval practitioners knew this from observation, and they justified it in humoral terms. The justification was wrong, the observation was right, and the child got better either way. There's a text I want to tell you about, because it is one of those historical documents that genuinely deserves to be better known. The Trotula. The Trotula is a collection of 3 medieval medical texts dealing specifically with women's medicine conditions of the female body pregnancy, childbirth, and the care of infants. It circulated widely across Europe from the 12th century onward, copied in monasteries and universities, and eventually translated into multiple languages including English, French, German, and Italian. Its origins are somewhat debated by historians. Some scholars have argued for a female author or compiler associated with the medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, while others see it as compiled by male physicians drawing on existing traditions. The question of authorship is genuinely interesting and still not entirely settled. What is not debated is its content, practical, detailed, often surprisingly compassionate medical guidance directed at the conditions that medieval women actually experienced. The Trotula discusses the management of difficult labors. It addresses the care of newborns. It describes treatments for common gynecological conditions using a combination of herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, and physical therapies. It advises on the use of specific plants, including remedies made from mint artesia and marshmallow root for complications of pregnancy. Some of this advice was wrong. Some of it, evaluated by modern medical standards, was genuinely harmful. I want to be honest about that. But some of it was right. And the mere existence of this text, its wide circulation, its translation into so many languages, its presence in household collections alongside devotional texts and recipe collections, tells us something important. There was a serious, sustained European-wide conversation about women's medicine in the medieval period. It was not ignored. It was studied, copied, debated, and used. Let me bring this into the home now, because the texts are one thing, and the lived reality is another. Think about what it actually meant to manage illness in a medieval household. Fever was terrifyingly common, and in a world before antibiotics, a fever that we would treat today with a pill and a good night's sleep could become within days genuinely life-threatening. Medieval women managing a feverish family member were working against a clock they could not see with tools that were effective, but not always. Sufficient in conditions, poor ventilation, crowded sleeping spaces, limited clean water that actively worked against recovery. The standard fever management approach in medieval English domestic medicine, documented in household medical recipe collections from the 13th and 14th centuries, combined several elements simultaneously. Cooling the body with damp cloth soaked in water, and sometimes vinegar, which genuinely does help reduce surface temperature through evaporation. Giving the sick person liquids, frequently a practice we now know is critical for fever management, and which modern medicine still recommends as a first response. Preparing and administering herbal infusions chosen for their fever-reducing properties. This is not random superstition. This is a coherent, multi-pronged approach that combines measures we still consider correct with herbal treatments that in many cases we have since confirmed are pharmacologically active. Medieval women were not guessing. They were applying a body of knowledge, imperfect, incomplete, operating without the theoretical framework that modern medicine provides, but knowledge nonetheless. Real, tested, inherited, refined across generations, and then there were wounds. This is a dimension of medieval domestic medicine that I find particularly striking because in a world of agricultural work, blacksmithing, carpentry, and general outdoor physical labor, wounds were constant. Cuts from tools and knives, burns from the ever-present fire, crush injuries, animal bites, infections from splinters and thorns that went unnoticed until they became serious. The primary wound care in a medieval household fell to the woman of the house. Bald's Leech Book, that 9th century English medical compilation that circulated throughout the medieval period, contains an eye-catching remedy for wound infection that has attracted genuine scientific attention in recent decades. It describes a preparation made from garlic leek, or onion wine, and ox gall meaning bile from a cow's gall bladder brewed together in a brass vessel and left to stand for 9 days before application to infected wounds. In 2015, a team of researchers at the University of Nottingham decided to actually make this preparation and test it against modern bacterial cultures, including the notoriously antibiotic-resistant bacteria known as methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a hospital-acquired infection that causes serious problems in modern medicine. The preparation killed the bacteria, not partially, killed it almost completely. The researchers were, by their own account, genuinely startled. Think about that for a moment. A wound treatment written down in 9th century England, used and copied through the medieval period, administered by household women who understood it in terms of balancing humors and divine favor. And it worked. It genuinely, demonstrably, pharmacologically worked because garlic is strongly antimicrobial, because bile salts disrupt bacterial cell membranes, because wine's alcohol content contributes to the antibacterial effect, because brass vessels leach small amounts of copper ions, which are themselves antimicrobial. No one sitting in a medieval cottage knew any of that. They knew the remedy worked because they had seen it work, and they kept using it. Do you have something in your family, a remedy that your grandmother swore by, some food, or drink that your parents insisted would help when you were sick? Something that you maybe rolled your eyes at as a child, and then, as an adult, quietly kept doing because it seemed to actually work. That is not such a different thing, really. That is inherited knowledge traveling forward through time. The mechanism may be mysterious. The theory may be wrong. But the observation that this thing helps can be right across many generations before anyone explains why. Medieval women were doing that every day with the health of everyone they loved. I want to spend a moment on childbirth because no account of medieval domestic medicine is honest without it. Childbirth in the medieval world was managed almost exclusively by women. The midwife, a woman of experience and recognized expertise in a village or town community, was the primary practitioner assisted by female neighbors and relatives. Male physicians were, by convention and by the practical reality that they were rarely accessible to ordinary people, essentially absent from the birth chamber. This was the domain of women's knowledge entirely. Medieval midwifery texts and household medical guides, particularly the sections of the Troda dealing with birth, describe a sophisticated understanding of normal labor progress of positions that might help a difficult birth, of herbal preparations used to ease pain or encourage contractions, and of the immediate care of the newborn. Mortality was high by modern standards. Tragically high. We should never pretend otherwise. The medieval birth chamber was a place of genuine danger, and no amount of herbal knowledge or midwifery skill could compensate for the absence of sterile conditions, of surgical capability, of blood transfusion, of any of the emergency interventions that modern obstetrics can offer. But within the limits of what was possible, medieval midwives were skilled. They were trained by apprenticeship, by observation, by years of attending births alongside more experienced women. They were respected in their communities. They were paid for their work, and their fees appear in household accounts from across England and France. And they saved lives. Many lives that without their knowledge would have been lost. There is something about the medieval household medicine tradition that I keep returning to, and I want to try to put it into words before we move on. We live in a world of extraordinary medical capability. Diseases that killed children routinely in the medieval world are now preventable with a single injection. Infections that would have been death sentences can be cleared in a week with a course of pills. The difference between their world and ours, measured in lives saved and suffering prevented, is incalculable. And yet something also existed in the medieval household medicine tradition that I think we have genuinely lost, and that I am not entirely sure was worthless. The woman who managed her family's health in a medieval household was present in a way that no modern healthcare system quite replicates. She knew her patients, every one of them, with an intimacy that no doctor and no hospital can offer. She watched the fever rise and fall. She sat through the night. She adjusted her treatments based on what she saw, not on what a chart said. She carried the weight of that responsibility every single day, and she did it with what she had, which was more often than we acknowledge quite a lot. From the physic garden to the wound dressing, from the fever remedy to the midnight birth. We've spent this part of our journey inside the most intimate dimension of medieval domestic life. The part where knowledge meant survival, and where women were the keepers of that knowledge, whether anyone formally acknowledged it or not. But a medieval household was not just one woman working alone in a garden or sitting beside a sick child. A household of any size was a small organization with multiple people to manage resources, to allocate decisions to make, and relationships to navigate. That required a kind of intelligence we rarely discuss when we talk about the Middle Ages. Because running a medieval household was in every real and meaningful sense an act of leadership. And the complexity of that leadership, the invisible administration that kept everything from falling apart, is what we're going to explore next. There's a document sitting in the British Library right now that almost nobody outside of medieval history circles has ever heard of. It is a set of household accounts handwritten in Latin and Middle English covering the years 1412 through 1413. They were kept by a woman named Alice Debrain, a Suffolk widow of moderate nobility who managed her estate at Acton in Suffolk entirely on her own after her husband's death. The accounts record in meticulous detail every single meal served at her household table over the course of a year, every guest who visited, every purchase of food, fuel, and supplies, every animal slaughtered for consumption, every expense down to the smallest transaction. Over the course of that single year, documented in her accounts, Alice Debrain's household fed a total of around 16,000 individual meals. 16,000. She tracked every one of them. And when I read about this woman, this quiet, precise, extraordinarily capable administrator, living in a Suffolk village 600 years ago, I keep thinking if she had been born in a different century, she would have run a company. She would have had a title, a corner officer team beneath her. People would have studied her methods. Instead, she had an account book, and she kept it perfectly. The management of a medieval household, particularly a household of any significant size, was an act of genuine organizational complexity that most modern people, I think, fundamentally underestimate. Let me try to make that concrete. A moderately large medieval manor household, not a great noble establishment, but the kind of upper gentry or lesser noble household that was reasonably common across England and France in the 13th and 14th centuries, might include somewhere between 15 and 40 people living and working under one roof or within the immediate estate complex. That population included indoor servants responsible for cooking, cleaning, and personal attendance, outdoor workers managing the kitchen garden, the livestock, and the fuel supply, skilled specialists like a blacksmith or a carpenter on retainer, guests who arrived unannounced and were expected to be fed and housed according to strict conventions of medieval hospitality, children of the household in various stages of education and training, and possibly additional young people from neighboring families sent to serve as part of their own social education. A common practice in medieval noble households. Every single one of these people needed to be fed, housed, clothed in households that provided livery, a standard issue of clothing to servants, managed in their duties, disciplined when necessary, motivated to work well, kept from conflicts that could poison the atmosphere of a small, enclosed community with nowhere else to go. All of that was the responsibility of the woman at the head of the household, not as a secondary concern alongside her other duties as a primary function. The title for this role in a French or Anglo-Norman household was Chaton, the lady of the castle or manor. But the word undersells the reality because Chaton sounds decorative, ornamental, a woman presiding gracefully over a beautiful home. The reality was closer to operations director, human resources manager, procurement specialist, and chief financial officer, all simultaneously, all without a salary, all without formal recognition of the expertise required. Let me walk you through what a typical day of household administration might actually look like for the woman running a moderately sized medieval manor. Morning began with a review of what was available, not in the abstract specifically. How much grain was in the storage? How many days of bread could be made from it before resupply was needed? Which animals were ready for slaughter this week, and which needed to be kept for breeding? Was the ale supply sufficient, or did brewing need to begin today? Because ale, this standard drink of the medieval household, took several days to ferment, and could not simply be ordered on short notice. These were not questions she could look up in a database or send an email about. They required her to know her own household's resources with precision, to carry in her head a running inventory that adjusted daily as supplies were consumed, replenished, or unexpectedly depleted. You know what this reminds me of? That feeling of trying to cook dinner for a group of people with whatever happens to be in your refrigerator, while simultaneously realizing you forgot to buy something critical, while someone is asking you a question. While something is about to boil over on the stove, multiply that by about 40 people every day for your entire adult life without the option of just ordering delivery. Beyond the daily inventory, there was the longer-term planning that household management required. And this is the part that I find most genuinely impressive. Medieval households operated on seasonal rhythms we've already touched on in earlier parts of this journey. But the planning horizon for a well-managed household extended well beyond the current week or month. A competent chatelaine was thinking in January about what she needed to have purchased, grown, preserved, and stored by the following November. She needed to know how much salt to buy in late summer for the autumn pig slaughter, how many barrels to have ready for salted fish, whether last year's clip had been sufficient, and whether to expand the sheep flock or reduce it based on the household's cloth needs, whether the kitchen garden needed to be expanded to cover a gap in the vegetable supply, and if so, which beds to clear and how to prepare them. This was multi-year, multi-variable planning conducted without spreadsheets or planning software carried in a human memory that also had to simultaneously manage the immediate daily demands of feeding and running a large household. It was by any honest measure extraordinary. There are manuals that survive from the medieval period that were written specifically to help with this work, and reading them is one of the more quietly thrilling experiences that medieval history can offer. We have already mentioned laymen to Perry briefly in our earlier conversation, the detailed French household guide written around 1393, but I want to come back to it here in a different context, because in its sections on household administration, it reveals something remarkable about what was expected of a medieval household manager. The text advises its reader addressed as a young wife being educated by her considerably older husband on matters, including how to hire good servants and how to recognize bad ones before committing to them, how to supervise servants without micromanaging them to the point of resentment, how to manage a household budget across different categories of expenditure, how to negotiate with merchants and tradespeople without being overcharged, and how to handle the inevitable conflicts and grievances that arose when many people lived and worked in close proximity. The section on servant management is particularly striking by modern standards. It advises the household mistress to be firm, but fair, to praise good work publicly and address failures privately, to understand which servants needed close supervision and which worked better with autonomy. This is almost word for word what modern management literature says about good leadership. Written 600 years ago, for a woman running a medieval French household, the question of servants deserves more attention than it usually gets, because the servant population of a medieval household was not a simple, undifferentiated group of people doing interchangeable work. A well-organized medieval household had a clear internal hierarchy among its servants, a structure that its mistress was expected to understand and maintain. At the upper level were the household officers, a steward or senial who managed the overall estate accounts and represented the lord's interests in legal and financial matters, a chamberlain or chamber attendant who managed the private living quarters, and in larger households, a marshal responsible for the horses and travel arrangements. Below them were the skilled household servants, the cook whose expertise was genuine and whose position in the household was correspondingly respected, the butler responsible for the wine and ale cellar, the baker if the household was large enough to warrant one. Below them were the general servants, the men and women who carried, cleaned, fetched, scrubbed, and performed the physical labor that kept the household running. The chatelaine's relationship with each level of this hierarchy was different. With the upper household officers, her relationship was collaborative. She needed their expertise, and they needed her authority. With the skilled servants, it was supervisory. She needed to know enough about their work to recognize whether it was being done well. With the general servants, it was directorial, clear expectations, consistent consequences, and enough visible fairness that the community of people crammed into close quarters did not deteriorate into resentment and poor work. Getting any of these relationships wrong had immediate practical consequences. A cook who felt disrespected might leave, and finding a competent replacement cook for a large medieval household was not a quick or easy matter. Servants who felt unfairly treated compared to their colleagues became unreliable, careless, or quietly obstructive in ways that were difficult to identify and address. A steward who was given too much independence might begin managing estate finances in his own interests rather than his employer's. These were not abstract management problems. They were the daily texture of running a medieval household, and they required exactly the kind of perceptive, politically aware, interpersonally sophisticated intelligence that we rarely associate with domestic work. Let me tell you something specific about Alcester Breen's accounts that I find particularly telling. Among the entries in her household records, and historians who have studied these accounts, particularly the detailed analysis published by the medievalist Penelope E. Dunn and others who have worked with this material have noted this pattern. Clearly, there are regular entries for hospitality provided to an extraordinary range of guests: local gentry, traveling merchants, royal officials passing through, members of the clergy, neighbors of various social ranks, occasional travelers who appear only once. Medieval hospitality was not optional. It was a moral and social obligation governed by conventions that were understood by everyone and from which deviation carried real reputational consequences. A noble household that failed to provide adequate hospitality to an appropriate guest was a household whose standing in the community suffered accordingly, which meant that Alice Dean, like every Shetland before and after her, had to be prepared at essentially any moment to feed and house guests. She had not anticipated at a standard appropriate to their social rank from resources she was simultaneously conserving for her household's winter needs the ability to absorb an unexpected demand, to improvise graciously, to produce a meal that honored a guest without depleting resources needed for next week was not a minor skill. It required deep knowledge of her own stores, quick thinking about substitutions and adjustments, and the authority to redirect her kitchen staff instantly without creating confusion. Hospitality in the medieval world was a kind of stress test of the household management system, and the woman who passed that test consistently, smoothly, without visible effort was doing something that deserved far more recognition than it received. There is one more dimension of medieval household administration that I want to bring into this, because it is the dimension that connects most directly to the world outside the house walls. Purchasing, negotiation, commerce. A medieval household of any size was a significant economic actor in its local community. It bought grain, livestock, cloth, candles, fuel, salt, spices, wine, and dozens of other commodities regularly in quantity from a network of local producers, market traders, and traveling merchants. And the woman who managed that purchasing, whether directly or through servants she supervised, was engaged in economic negotiation that required market knowledge, awareness of fair pricing, the ability to assess quality, and the interpersonal skill to build relationships with reliable suppliers while avoiding being exploited by unreliable ones. English manor household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries, including the extraordinarily detailed accounts of the Countess of Leicester, Evelina D'Entfort from the 1260s, record regular purchasing of goods across a wide range of categories with prices that show clear awareness of market fluctuation and strategic timing of purchases to take advantage of seasonal price variations. Evelina de Montfort's accounts show grain purchased in bulk at harvest time when prices were low, fish bought in quantity during the autumn herring season, spices acquired through established merchant contacts whose reliability had been tested over time. This was not passive consumption. This was active, strategically informed economic management. The medieval household mistress who managed these purchasing decisions well saved her household real money, or rather real resources that translated directly into the family's well-being and financial stability. She was in economic terms a skilled procurement manager operating in a complex and sometimes unpredictable market without ever being called one. I keep returning to the same feeling as we move through these different dimensions of medieval household work. There is a profound mismatch between the complexity of what these women did and the way it has been described, or more often simply not described by history. The medieval household was an organization. It had a budget. It had staff. It had supply chains and inventory management, and relationship networks and strategic planning horizons. And it had a leader who was never formally appointed, who received no salary, who had no title that history thought worth recording, who could not resign when the work became overwhelming, and who was not thanked publicly when things went well, but whose competence or whose failure determined whether the people in her care stayed warm, stayed healthy, and faced the next year with their resources intact or depleted. That is not a small thing to carry. That was never a small thing. We have been inside the medieval home now for 7 parts of this journey together. We have seen its fire, its cleaning rhythms, its food stores, its water management, its textile work, its medicine, and now the quiet organizational genius of the people who held it all together. But there was one battle being fought inside those homes that we have not yet talked about. A battle that was never won, only managed day after day, season after season. A battle against something that shared the medieval home uninvited, that lived in the walls, in the floor, in the mattresses, in every dark corner where a candle did not reach. The medieval home was not just occupied by people, and the story of what else lived there, and what extraordinary lengths medieval households went to in order to manage it, is honestly one of the most surprising and darkly fascinating chapters in the whole story of domestic life. That is coming up next. If I asked you right now to name the one thing you would miss most if you suddenly had to live without modern convenience, what would you say? Hot showers, maybe electricity, the internet, your phone. I would put good money on the fact that almost nobody watching this right now would answer pest control. And yet, if you had asked a medieval householder that same question, reformulated of course for their world, I genuinely believe the answer would have had something to do with the relentless, exhausting, never-ending battle against the creatures that shared their home without invitation, without apology, and without any intention of leaving. Because the medieval home was not just a human space. It was an ecosystem, and the humans living in it were in a very real sense in constant negotiation with everything else that had decided to move in alongside them. Tonight we are going inside that negotiation, and I promise you some of what you're about to hear will make you look at your own home rather differently. Let us start with a place where most people spent roughly a third of their lives. The bed. Not the bed you're probably lying in right now. Your mattress with its inner springs or memory foam, its fitted sheet, its clean pillow. I mean the medieval bed, and specifically I mean what lived inside it. The typical sleeping surface in a medieval home, across almost every social level below, the very highest nobility, was a mattress made of cloth stuffed with some combination of straw, hay, wool, fleece, or dried plant material. Wealthier households might use feather-stuffed mattresses, which were considerably more comfortable and also considerably more expensive. Poorer households slept on straw pallets laid directly on the floor. All of these materials shared one important characteristic. They were organic, warm, slightly damp from human proximity. Exactly the kind of environment that certain small creatures found absolutely ideal. Bed bugs, tiny flat reddish-brown insects that feed on the blood of sleeping humans, were endemic in medieval homes at virtually every social level. Archaeological excavations of medieval sites across northern Europe, including detailed work done at sites in York, London, and several Scandinavian towns, have recovered bedbug remains and sediment layers associated with sleeping areas and domestic refuse. They were not rare. They were not a sign of particular poverty or neglect. They were simply part of the medieval sleeping environment as much as the straw mattress itself, and medieval people knew it. What I find genuinely fascinating, and this is the part where medieval ingenuity keeps surprising me, is the sophistication of the responses that medieval households developed for managing this problem. Bald's Leech Book, the 9th century English medical compilation that circulated widely throughout the medieval period, contains specific remedies for dealing with biting insects in sleeping areas. Several involve fumigation, burning particular plant materials to produce smoke that drove insects out of bedding and sleeping spaces. Mugwort and southern wood, a bitter, strongly aromatic member of the Artemisia family, appear repeatedly in these contexts. They're pungent, volatile oils genuinely effective at deterring insects from treated surfaces. But beyond fumigation, medieval households developed a practice of periodic mattress replacement that was so regular it appeared in household accounts as a routine expense. The detailed household records of the English royal court, particularly the wardrobe account from the reigns of Edward I and Edward II in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, contain regular entries for the purchase of fresh straw for mattress refreshing. Not occasionally, seasonally. The straw in mattresses was turned out the casing aired, and sometimes washed fresh straw put in, and the whole thing treated with whatever aromatic deterrents were available. This was not considered unusual housekeeping. It was standard maintenance, and the households that skipped it, that left mattress straw unchanged through multiple seasons, found themselves dealing with infestations that multiplied rapidly in the warm, sheltered environment of an inhabited sleeping space, spreading across a household before anyone quite realized what was happening. Now, from the bed to the grain store, because the creatures that threatened the food supply were in many ways an even more serious problem than those that disturb people's sleep, rats and mice. Medieval grain storage, the bins, barrels, and granary buildings that held the wheat, rye, oats, and barley that a household depended on through winter, was under constant assault from rodents. Rat populations in medieval settlements could be substantial. Historical ecologists studying medieval English towns have estimated, based on the carrying capacity of the environments and the frequency of rodent remains in archaeological deposits, that some urban areas supported rat populations that were genuinely significant relative to the human population. These were not a minor nuisance. A rat infestation in a grain store was a food security emergency. Rats do not just eat grain. They contaminate far more than they consume through droppings and urine, making stored food unsafe in quantities that could represent a meaningful fraction of a household's winter supply. Medieval households fought this problem on several fronts simultaneously. The first and most effective line of defense was one that households maintained not as pest control equipment, but as a cherished member of the family, the cat. Now, I know that sounds obvious. Of course, medieval people had cats, but the relationship between medieval households and their cats was considerably more formal and economically significant than the modern pet relationship might suggest. Welsh law codes from the 10th century, the Laws of Hill D-Day, one of the most detailed early medieval legal compilations in Northern Europe, assigned specific monetary values to cats based on their proven ability to catch mice. A cat that had demonstrated its skill as a mouser was worth more legally than one that had not yet proven itself. Killing or stealing a valued mouser carried a financial penalty calculated partly on the value of the grain the cat was expected to protect. A cat was working capital, a documented, legally recognized economic asset. And in medieval households that kept careful accounts, including several English memorial records from the 13th and 14th centuries, the feeding of the household cat appears as a regular expense line alongside the feeding of working dogs and livestock. The cat earned its keep, and everyone understood this. Beyond cats, medieval households used physical traps for rodents, devices that appear in various forms in manuscript illustrations and in the inventories of medieval households. Simple spring traps using bent wood and cord, cage traps baited with food, in some cases drowning traps using vessels of water positioned where rodent runs have been identified. There's something almost melancholy about the ingenuity of these traps. The careful observation of animal behavior, that their design required the knowledge of where mice ran and what they were attracted to, all applied to the thoroughly unromantic business of keeping the pantry intact. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. Every trap in a medieval household represented knowledge. Somebody had watched. Somebody had noticed where the mice came through the wall, how they moved along the floor joists, what they were drawn to, how they could be caught. That knowledge was passed on, adjusted, refined. It was in its modest way applied science in a house with an earthen floor and a thatched roof, and no running water. Speaking of thatched roofs, because this is a dimension of the pest problem that almost never gets mentioned, and it genuinely surprised me when I first learned about it, the thatch itself. A thatched roof in a medieval home was not just a covering. It was a living habitat. The dense, warm, relatively sheltered interior of a well-laid thatch was home to a remarkable range of uninvited tenants, sparrows and starlings that nested in the outer layers, mice that ran through the interior, and in the smoke-darkened thatch of a home with a central open hearth, a range of insects that found the warm, protected space ideal for overwintering. Medieval householders were aware of this. Some accepted it as the natural condition of their homes. Others worked actively to manage it. periodically relaying or patching thatch in ways that disrupted established insect and rodent habitats, or treating the interior of the thatch with smoke from particular plant materials known to drive out inhabitants. There is a particular image that stays with me from medieval manuscript illustrations. The occasional depiction of a home with small birds sitting on its roof ridge and a cat watching from below with an expression that transcends all centuries. Some things about domestic life have not changed as fundamentally as we might think. Now let us talk about something that affected medieval homes in a way that is deeply connected to food, to flies, and to the economics of smell. Medieval households, particularly in summer, and particularly in any home that kept meat, fish, or dairy products, faced a constant problem with flying insects. Flies were drawn to food stores, to the kitchen area, to the table during meals, and to any stored meat or fish in a way that could rapidly render carefully preserved food unsafe. The fly problem was serious enough that specific household equipment was developed to address it. Fly whisks, bundles of feathers or strips of cloth, or dried plant stems tied together and used to drive flies away from food during meals appear in household inventories from across medieval Europe. There are illustrations in French and English manuscripts showing servants standing beside laden tables specifically to wave flies away from the food while the household ate. In wealthier households, food at table was sometimes covered between servings with cloth or with light wicker covers specifically designed for the purpose. Medieval kitchen areas sometimes used bundles of elder leaves. Elder having natural insect-repelling properties that medieval households recognize through observation, hung near meat preparation areas to reduce fly activity. And here's a detail I find wonderful in its specificity. Several medieval household management texts advise hanging bundles of fresh mint near the kitchen area in summer, specifically because flies dislike the strong volatile oils in mint leaves. Mint, something that almost every herb garden in medieval England would have contained, used not just for cooking and medicine, but as a fly deterrent in the kitchen. Everything in the medieval home had multiple purposes. Nothing was just one thing. I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely. When is the last time you thought seriously about insects in your home? Not a spider in the corner that you noticed and maybe relocated. I mean the kind of thinking where you're strategically planning how to keep insects out of your food supply off your sleeping surface and away from your children while they eat. For most of us in the modern developed world, that is not a thought we have with any regularity. We have screens on our windows. We have refrigerators that seal our food away from flies. We have mattresses filled with materials that do not provide habitat for insects. We have pest control services a phone call away. The medieval household manager thought about insects constantly, not anxiously or not always anxiously, but as a continuous background concern that shaped decisions about food storage, about where things were kept, about what materials were used for what purposes. It was a form of environmental management, sustained, intelligent, and conducted without any of the tools we would consider basic. There is one more aspect of the battle against filth and unwanted inhabitants that I want to bring in because it connects the practical and the social in a way I find particularly revealing about medieval life. Smell. The management of household odor in the medieval world was not simply an aesthetic concern. It was deeply tied to medieval medical understanding, the prevailing belief shared across educated and folk medicine alike, that bad smells were themselves a source of illness. The theory of miasma that disease spread through corrupted air meant that a household that smelled bad was not just unpleasant. It was by the understanding of the time dangerous. This belief was wrong in its mechanism, but it was not entirely wrong in its practical implications. Environments that smelled bad in medieval terms, stagnant water, decomposing organic material, accumulated waste, genuinely were more likely to harbor disease. The correlation was real, even if the causal explanation was incorrect. And so the management of household smell was taken seriously as a health measure, not just a comfort measure. Permander's small perforated containers holding aromatic substances like dried citrus peel cloves, ambergris and musk were carried by wealthier medieval people and hung in rooms as both personal protection and household fragrance management. Their expense meant they were markers of status as much as practical tools. But even in more modest households, bundles of dried herbs, rosemary, rosemary were burned or simply hung in living spaces specifically to counteract bad smells and in the belief of the time, to purify the air. The economics of medieval household fragrance were in a small way their own industry. Merchants selling dried aromatics in medieval English market towns were selling something that households genuinely believed affected their health. They were also incidentally selling something that made a difficult living environment more bearable. And that is not nothing. Sometimes the comfort of a pleasant smell in a difficult world is its own kind of medicine. We have spent this part of our journey in the less glamorous corners of medieval domestic life. The mattress, the grain store, the kitchen in summer, the smoky thatch overhead, the places where the battle against nature was fought every single day, without glory and without any prospect of final victory. And yet medieval households managed. They developed systems. They accumulated knowledge. They kept their families alive and their homes functional through methods that required constant attention and genuine ingenuity. But there is one task we have circled around and not yet entered directly. One that was so physically demanding, so time-consuming, and so universally dreaded across every social class in the medieval world that households wealthy enough to avoid it paid others to do it, and households that could not avoid it built their entire weekly schedule around it. The laundry. And when I tell you what medieval laundry actually involved, the chemistry of it, the labor of it, the sheer physical endurance it required, I think you will understand exactly why. When the washing machine was invented, women wept with relief. That story is next. Monday. In most modern households, Monday is just another day of the week. You wake up, you go about your business, the laundry gets done whenever it gets done. A load here, a load there, the machine running quietly in the background while you do something else entirely. In a medieval household, Monday was not just a day. Monday, or more precisely, one specific day every week or every 2 weeks, depending on the size of the household and the season, was laundry day. And laundry day was not a background task. It was a total mobilization. It rearranged the entire household around itself. It required planning that began the day before and recovery that extended into the day after. It was by every honest measure one of the most physically punishing regular tasks in the entire medieval domestic calendar. And the fact that we now accomplish the same thing by pressing a button and walking away is, when you really think about it, one of the most profound transformations in the history of human labor. Let me take you through what medieval laundry actually was. The process began the night before, and this detail alone tells you something important about the scale of the undertaking. In preparation for a laundry day, a large wooden vessel called a bucking tub, essentially a barrel or a deep wooden vat, sometimes the size of a small bathtub, was positioned in the yard or kitchen area. The soiled linen and woolen items to be washed were placed inside it, along with a quantity of wood ash wrapped in a coarse cloth to act as a filter. Boiling water was then poured over the ash and the cloth together, slowly percolating down through the fabric, and the ash becoming increasingly alkaline as it absorbed the potassium compound from the burnt wood. This alkaline liquid, the lye that we mentioned in an earlier part of our journey, though today we are seeing it in action, rather than just hearing about its chemistry, was the primary cleaning agent for the heavy work of medieval laundering. The cloth sat in this solution sometimes overnight, sometimes for several hours, soaking the alkaline lye, working its way through the fibers, breaking down the oils and organic matter that accumulated in worn fabric over the preceding days. This first stage was called bucking, and it was just the beginning. What came next is where you really begin to understand why laundry day was dreaded. After the bucking, the cloth had to be physically worked, beaten, scrubbed, or pounded to drive the loosened dirt out of the fibers and into the wash water. In rural areas near rivers or streams, this was done on flat stones at the water's edge. The wet, heavy cloth and wet linen is astonishingly heavy, far heavier than you might expect, was laid across the stone and beaten repeatedly with a heavy wooden implement called a batting staff, a washing bat, or sometimes a beetle. These were not gentle pats. They were full, heavy strokes applied with real force over and over until the fabric was judged sufficiently clean. If you have ever wrung out a heavy wet towel by hand and found it unexpectedly difficult, multiply that sensation by the weight of bed linen, a household's worth of undergarments, and a tablecloth, and then add the physical demand of beating it repeatedly with a heavy stick, often while standing in cold water at the edge of a river in conditions that were frequently less than pleasant. Medieval washerwomen had exceptionally strong arms. The archaeological and skeletal evidence confirms this. Studies of female skeletal remains from medieval English sites have identified patterns of muscle attachment and bone development in the arms and shoulders consistent with years of heavy upper body labor patterns that researchers have linked specifically to the repetitive physical demands of textile processing and laundering. Their bodies recorded what history forgot to write down. Now I want to stop for a moment and complicate the picture a little, because laundry in the medieval world was not only a household task done by the women of the home. In towns and cities of any significant size, professional laundresses existed. Washerwomen who took in laundry for payment, who operated at the edges of rivers and streams with established washing spots, who were recognizable figures in the social landscape of medieval urban life. In Paris, the washerwomen of the Sun, who worked along the river banks using flat-bottomed wooden boats called bateaux lavoirs as mobile washing platforms, were a sufficiently established professional group that their work appears in guild-adjacent records from as early as the 13th century. They had territories, they had rates, they had professional reputations that attracted or drove away business. London's washerwomen similarly congregated at the Thames and at various streams, feeding into it at locations that appear in medieval city records as recognized washing places spots, where the combination of flowing water, accessible banks, and established custom made them the de facto laundry infrastructure of the city. These women were not invisible to their contemporaries, even if history has tended to overlook them. They appear in city records. They appear in legal disputes over riverside access. They appear occasionally in the complaints of neighbors about the noise and the presence of laundry spread across hedges and fields to dry. They were workers in a genuine trade, and their trade was indispensable. Here is something that genuinely surprised me when I first learned about it, and that I think reveals something important about how medieval society thought about cleanliness and status. White linen in the medieval world. The whiteness of a household's linen, its bed sheets, its tablecloths, its personal undergarments was not simply an aesthetic preference. It was a legible social signal. White linen required more work than unbleached linen. It had to be washed more frequently to maintain its brightness. It required exposure to sunlight over multiple sessions, a bleaching process that medieval laundresses understood and practiced, deliberately laying white cloth in the sun after washing specifically to use ultraviolet light to whiten the fibers. Though again, without any theoretical understanding of why this worked, only the observed knowledge that it did. A household with consistently white linen was a household that had the resources to wash frequently, the labor to manage intensive laundry care, and access to enough clean water and sunlight to maintain that standard. White linen was a performance of prosperity, and everyone who saw it knew how to read it. This is why laundry appears so frequently in medieval household accounts at the upper social levels. Not because those households did more laundry than poorer ones, but because the maintenance of white linen was considered an important marker of the household's standing, worth the expense of professionals or the significant investment of household servant time. The English royal household accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries contain regular payments specifically for the laundering of royal linen managed by a household officer called Theris, whose position was formally recognized within the royal domestic structure. This was not an informal arrangement. It was a designated professional role within the most important household in the kingdom. Laundry was taken that seriously. Let me take you to a village washing day now, because I think the communal dimension of medieval laundry is one of its most humanly interesting aspects, and one that we have almost entirely lost in our era of private machines behind closed doors. In a small rural community, laundry day was often a collective event. Women from multiple households would gather at the ville's water source, a stream, a mill pond, a river stretch, designated by custom for washing, bringing their household's laundry together, and working alongside one another for the better part of a day. This was practical. The work was heavy enough that having company helped both for assistance with the most demanding physical tasks, and for the simple fact that several hours of beating wet cloth against a stone is considerably more bearable with conversation. But it was also social. The communal washing place was in many medieval villages one of the primary spaces where women talked genuinely, talked at length without the presence of men, about the things that concerned them, about their households and their children and their neighbors, about prices of the market and difficulties with harvests. about illness in the village and disputes between families. Historians who study medieval social history, including the work of scholars who have analyzed the content of medieval court records for evidence of informal social networks, have noted that the washing place along with the well and the market appears repeatedly as a location where information circulated, where community opinion formed, and where the social fabric of a village was continuously woven and repaired. The laundry was not just laundry. It was also in its modest way the news. There is a particular dimension of medieval cloth care that goes beyond the washing and into something rather more specialized. And I want to spend a moment here because it connects the domestic laundry work to a much larger economic world. Fooling newly woven woolen cloth straight off the loom, as we talked about in our earlier section on textile work, was not yet the finished product. It was loose, open weave, and relatively fragile. To become the dense, warm, durable fabric that medieval clothing required, it needed to be fooled, pounded, and worked in water, often with the addition of fulling earth, a type of clay with absorbent properties, until the wool fibers matted together, and the cloth contracted into a tighter, sturdier structure. In the early medieval period, this was done by foot workers treading cloth in large vats of water, walking on it for hours at a time in what was genuinely exhausting labor. The workers who did this were called walkers, and walker remains a common English surname today, carried forward from a medieval trade that involved literally walking on wet wool for a living. From approximately the 12th century onward, fulling mills, water-powered mills that used the turning of a water wheel to raise and drop heavy wooden hammers on a cloth submerged in water, began replacing the manual treading process in much of England and Northern Europe. The fulling mill is one of the genuinely significant technological developments of the medieval period because it transferred an enormous amount of human physical labor to mechanical power. Cloth that would have required hours of manual treading could be processed in a fraction of the time by a mill. But the point I want to make is this. Even with the fulling mill handling this stage of the process, the cloth still had to be washed, still had to be beaten, still had to be rinsed and wrung and dried and pressed. The machine took some of the work. It did not take all of it. It never does. Rinsing deserves its own moment, because it is a step that I think most people imagining medieval laundry simply skip over in their mental picture. After washing and beating wet cloth full of alkaline lye and loosened dirt had to be rinsed thoroughly in clean water. Multiple times often because lye left in cloth irritated skin, and because fabric that retained dirt from incomplete rinsing would smell and deteriorate faster. In winter, this rinsing happened in water that was depending on the source close to freezing. Women rinsing laundry at a river's edge in February in England were working with hands submerged in water, cold enough to cause genuine pain within minutes for periods of time that could extend to an hour or more, depending on the quantity of laundry. There are records brief, incidental, embedded in other documents rather than central to any narrative of laresses and washerwomen developing chronic conditions of the hands and joints that historians of medieval medicine have associated with prolonged exposure to both cold water and alkaline lye. Cracked skin, inflammation, the kind of persistent hand pain that becomes background noise in a life structured around wet, cold, chemical-laden manual labor. They kept working because the laundry did not wait. After all the washing, the beating, the rinsing, and the wringing, which was done by hand, twisting the cloth with as much force as could be applied, and which for large items like bed sheets was often done by two people, twisting in opposite directions, the clean laundry had to dry, and drying in a world without tumble dryers was entirely dependent on weather. Sun and wind were ideal. Cloth spread on hedges draped over wooden frames laid on clean grass in a field. This was the standard drying approach in good weather. And on a fine summer laundry day, a medieval garden or field could look like an extremely industrious textile exhibition. But in English winters, and English winters in the medieval period were no more cooperative than English winters today, drying laundry was a genuine problem. Cloth brought inside to dry near the fire filled the room with steam and the particular heavy, damp smell of drying fabric. It slowed the process dramatically. It sometimes had to be turned and repositioned multiple times to dry evenly, and in genuinely cold or wet weather, it might simply not dry fully in a single day, requiring the entire process to extend into the following morning. Medieval household management texts, including the practical household advice sections of Walter of Henley's Farming Guide from the mid-13th century, mention the timing of laundry days in relation to weather in ways that suggest households were genuinely strategic about choosing their wash days based on what the sky appeared to be offering. They were reading the weather, planning around it, scheduling their most labor-intensive household task around the cooperation or refusal of an English sky. Some things honestly have not changed as much as we pretend. There's a moment that I want to leave you with before we move forward. Sometime in the 1950s, when the electric washing machine was becoming accessible to working-class households across the United States and the United Kingdom, researchers and journalists recorded accounts from women describing their reaction to the machine for the first time. Several described crying, not from gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of what they had been carrying, what their mothers had carried, what their grandmothers before them had carried, not in machines, but in their bodies, in their hands, in the hours of their lives that had gone into the work of keeping fabric clean. That weight suddenly lifted felt like more than time saved. It felt like a life given back. I think about that when I think about medieval laundry, about the women who did it not once, but every week or every 2 weeks for their entire adult lives, about the cold water and the heavy cloth in the hands that cracked and healed and cracked again. They did not have a machine coming. They did not know that one would ever exist. They just did the work. We followed the medieval household through its most demanding physical labors. The fire, the cleaning, the food, the water, the spinning and weaving, the medicine, the management, the battle against pests, and now the laundry that underpinned all of it. But there is something we have not yet talked about that I find quietly extraordinary. The way the medieval home changed with the seasons. Not just in terms of what work needed to be done. We've touched on seasonal rhythms throughout this journey, but in the deeper sense, the way the physical space itself transformed. The way the household's entire rhythm of life shifted. The way medieval people experienced time not as a steady uniform flow, but as a great wheel turning each quarter, bringing its own demands, its own rituals, its own particular texture of daily existence. Because a medieval home in June and a medieval home in January were not just the same place in different temperatures. They were almost different worlds. And the work of navigating that transformation of preparing, adapting, and guiding a household through the full turn of the year is a story that has its own particular beauty. That is where we are headed next. Think about your home right now. The room you are in, the way it is arranged, the temperature it is kept at. Now ask yourself honestly, does your home in December feel fundamentally different from your home in June? Not just temperature-wise, but in the way space is used, the way rooms function, the hours you spend in different parts of the house, the rhythm of your days. For most of us, the honest answer is not really. We move the same furniture through the same spaces. We eat at the same table. We sleep in the same rooms. The thermostat adjusts, the wardrobe shifts slightly. And that is more or less the extent of it. In a medieval home, the seasons did not just change the temperature. They physically reorganized the house. They changed which rooms were habitable, which functions happened, where how many people slept in, which spaces, what furniture existed, in which configuration, and even in the grandest households, which parts of the building were used at all. The medieval home breathed with the year. It expanded and contracted. It darkened and brightened. It shifted its very center of gravity, depending on where the sun was in the sky. And understanding that rhythm, I think, is the key to understanding something about medieval life. That purely task-focused history tends to miss entirely what it actually felt like to live in that world across the full turning of a year. Let us start in winter, because winter was where the medieval home revealed its true character most starkly. By November, the month that medieval English agricultural calendars marked as the beginning of the indoor season, the transformation of the household was already underway. The great hall of a manor house, or larger farmstead, which in summer might have been a relatively airy and open space, where work and meals and social life spread comfortably across the available floor area, became in winter the thermal core of the entire building. Every other room was essentially abandoned to the cold. Medieval stone structures were poor insulators by modern standards. Stone conducts heat away from any warm interior quickly, and without the insulation layers we now build into walls, A medieval stone room, not actively heated by a fire, became within hours of a fire going out almost as cold as the outdoor air, so the household contracted. People moved toward the heat. The great hall with its central hearth, or its increasingly common wall fireplace in the later medieval period, became the place where almost everything happened. Sleeping in households where separate sleeping chambers existed might migrate from private rooms back to the hall floor, where bodies clustered around the fire's warmth in arrangements that prioritized survival over privacy. Medieval household inventories from English estates in the 13th and 14th centuries show furnishings allocated to the hall in winter that were stored elsewhere in summer: additional bed frames, extra pallets, portable screens used to block drafts. The hall was being seasonally configured as a winter shelter in a way that its summer arrangement did not require. There is a specific medieval household practice that I want to tell you about, because it is one of those details that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. In wealthier medieval households, particularly in England and France from roughly the 12th century onward, the lord and lady of the house had private sleeping chambers called the solar positioned, typically above the main hall and accessed by an interior stair. These were the most private and most comfortable spaces in the house, reserved for the family's most intimate domestic life. In summer, the solar was in regular use, a retreat from the noise and activity of the hall below, a place for personal business and private conversation, and the relatively rare luxury of solitude. In winter, even the solar was sometimes abandoned. The cost in firewood of heating a separate upstairs chamber away from the hall's main fire was simply too high for many households to sustain through the long cold months. And so the family came downstairs back to the hall, back to the shared warmth, back to the communal arrangement that medieval winter demanded of even moderately comfortable households. Winter in the medieval world was a leveler, not between social classes. The wealthy still had considerably more comfort than the poor, but between the private individual and the communal group, between the desire for solitude and the biological necessity of shared warmth. You kept warm together, or you did not keep warm at all. The light. This is the dimension of medieval winter that I find most personally affecting when I try to imagine it. And I think it is the one that modern people surrounded by artificial light of every kind are least equipped to truly picture. At the winter solstice in England, the shortest day of the year, occurring around the 21st of December, usable daylight lasted approximately 7.5 hours. In a world lit only by fire and candle, the practical working day in winter was even shorter than that, because the quality of candlelight was sufficient for some tasks and quite insufficient for others. Fine needlework, the kind of precise sewing and embroidery that formed a significant part of medieval textile production, essentially could not be done by candlelight without substantial eye strain and a rate of error that made the work unprofitable. Spinning was possible by firelight. Weaving on a large loom was difficult and slow. Reading for the small minority of medieval people who could read strained the eyes in a way that modern readers, who rarely attempt sustained reading by a single candle's light, genuinely cannot easily replicate. The medieval winter evening in a household without sufficient candles was dark in a way that is almost impossible for most modern people to physically experience. Not dim, dark, and that darkness structured the day in profound ways. Medieval people slept differently in winter than in summer. Historians of medieval sleep. And yes, there are scholars who have studied exactly this, including the work of Roger E. Kirch, whose research into pre-industrial sleep patterns has become genuinely influential, have found substantial evidence that medieval and early modern people practiced what is called segmented sleep, sleeping in two distinct periods, separated by an hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night. In winter, with darkness descending by mid-afternoon in northern latitudes, this pattern made a kind of organic sense. People went to bed earlier because there was nothing useful to do in the dark. They woke in the middle of the night, not from insomnia, but because their bodies were rested enough after a first sleep. They talked, prayed, tended the fire, sometimes visited neighbors in the brief interval between first and second sleep, and then they slept again until dawn. This was not dysfunction. This was the human body adapting to an environment it had evolved alongside, an environment of genuine sustained darkness in a way that our permanently lit world no longer requires or allows. Now, let me take you from the darkness of winter into the particular quality of a medieval spring. Because the seasonal transition was not just a change in temperature, it was an event. It was waited for, and when it came, it reorganized the household with as much thoroughness as the winter contraction had. We touched on spring cleaning in an earlier part of this journey, but I want to come back to it here in its fuller context because the spring cleaning of a medieval household was not simply tidying. It was a systematic dismantling and rebuilding of the domestic environment. The rushes that had been laid on the floor in autumn, now months old, compacted, holding the accumulated debris of a winter's indoor life, were pulled up and burned. Every surface that had been sealed against drafts and cold was opened. Shutters that had been closed through the dark months were thrown wide. Bedding was hauled outdoors, beaten aired for days in the spring breeze. The church calendar gave this cleaning a ritual framework. The period of Lent, the 40 days of fasting and reflection before Easter, that structured medieval Christian life throughout Europe fell in spring and brought with it a dietary shift that had direct implications for the household's food stores and cooking arrangements. The dairy products, meat, and eggs that had sustained the household through winter were restricted. Legumes, fish, and preserved vegetables came to the foreground. Easter itself was marked in medieval households, not just as a religious feast, but as a domestic reset point. New fires were sometimes kindled from blessed sources. Houses were freshened. The sense of renewal that we associate with spring had in the medieval world a genuinely structural dimension. The household was actually physically different after Easter than it had been in February. Can I ask you something that I find myself genuinely curious about? Do you have any seasonal rituals that actually transform your home? Not just cleaning, but something that marks the shift between one part of the year and another in a physical, tangible way. Most of us have lost this. We have heating and cooling that make our homes more or less the same temperature year-round. We have light that makes every evening equally usable. We have food systems that make every fruit and vegetable available in every season. The medieval household had none of that insulation from the natural world. The year came into the house. It rearranged the furniture. It changed where you slept and what you ate and when you went to bed. It came through the shutters in the morning light and through the cracks in the wall at night. And living in that close relationship with the turning of the year produced something that I think we have genuinely, measurably lost, a felt sense of time's passage, not measured in weeks on a calendar or hours on a phone, but in the quality of the light, the temperature of the water, and the morning bucket, the smell of the air coming through the door, the particular weight of what needed to be done right now, in this week, in this season before the window, closed and the moment passed until next year. Martimus deserves its own paragraph, because it is one of the most revealing of all the medieval calendar markers. The feast of St. Martin of Tours, celebrated on the 11th of November, throughout medieval Europe, marked the point at which the livestock that could not be fed through winter were slaughtered. Not a few animals. A significant portion of a year's flock and herd, the animals whose winter fodder, would cost more than their eventual value if kept alive, selected carefully, and dispatched efficiently in the cold air that served as natural refrigeration. In a single week around Martimus, a medieval household of any agricultural size underwent a transformation that was simultaneously practical and sensory. The smell of fresh blood and wood smoke, the sound of activity, the rapid movement of meat into salt and smoke and cellar, the sudden abundance of fresh offal that had to be consumed immediately before it spoiled, the making of puddings and sausages from scraps and blood that represented the only form of charcuterie that peasant households typically experienced. Martis was not sad despite the death it involved. Medieval accounts and poetry describe it as a time of abundance. The one moment in the year when even modest households ate meat freely, when the smell of roasting filled villages that would smell of boiled grain and dried fish for the next several months. It was the feast before the fast, the bright moment before the long winter dimming, and a household that managed Martis while that processed its animals efficiently preserved the meat, correctly rendered the fat for cooking and candle making, stored the hides for tanning, entered winter with resources that would see it through to spring. The household that managed it badly went hungry. There is one more seasonal transformation I want to bring into this because it speaks to something about the medieval household that goes beyond practicality into something closer to beauty. Summer, a medieval home in June, was in many respects an entirely different environment from its winter self. The hall that had contracted around its fire in January was now opened, its shutters wide, its floor perhaps freshly laid with sweet-smelling herbs. The solar was in use again. Outdoor spaces, the kitchen garden, the yard, the surrounding agricultural land became extensions of domestic life in a way that winter made impossible. Work that had been compressed indoors expanded outward. Spinning might happen on a bench in the sun rather than by firelight. Meals might be eaten outdoors in good weather. Children who had been kept close to the house by cold and dark ranged freely. The household breathed. Medieval illustrations of summer domestic life, particularly the calendar pages of illuminated manuscripts like the Tisch du Duc d'Ir, a masterpiece of early 15th century French manuscript painting, show households in summer as places of relative ease and movement. The indoor labor balanced by outdoor activity, the body less confined, the light generous and long. These images were idealized, certainly. The agricultural summer was intensely demanding in its own right, and the harvest weeks of late summer were among the most exhausting of the entire year for farming communities. But the light was real. The expanded space was real. The sense of a household temporarily released from winter's compression was real. And medieval people felt that release, I think, with an acuity that those of us who live in climate-controlled, permanently illuminated spaces simply cannot fully access anymore. The coming of summer light after months of genuine winter darkness was not a background event. It was felt in the body. It changed the quality of every day. It was in its quiet way one of the most significant experiences the medieval year had to offer. We have followed the medieval home through its full seasonal cycle now, from the contracted fire-lit darkness of January to the open sun-washed ease of June, and back through the great autumn preparations to the Martinus abundance and the long winter again. And what strikes me sitting with all of this is how much the medieval household was governed by something we have almost completely escaped: the reality of natural limits, limits of light, limits of warmth, limits of food supply, limits of what the season allowed and what it withheld. Those limits were not purely oppressive. They also gave life a shape, a rhythm, a texture, a sense of time passing that had weight and meaning. But there is one final dimension of all this that we have not yet fully examined. The candles, the tallow, the rushlight, the entire medieval economy of a light itself, how it was made, what it cost, who had access to it, and what it meant for a family to control or lack the ability to extend their day beyond the darkness. Because light in the medieval home was never free. And the story of how medieval households manufactured, rationed, and valued their light is one of the most quietly revealing windows into the economics and the daily texture of a world we've left very far behind. That is exactly where we're going next. Hold on for just a second. Before we go any further, I want you to do something. Look at whatever is lighting the room you're in right now. A lamp, a phone screen, maybe the soft glow of a television somewhere nearby. Maybe you've already turned everything down to almost nothing, which is perfect for what we're doing here. Now, imagine that everything you are seeing, every single photon of artificial light in your environment has a direct, measurable, non-trivial cost. Not just on your electricity bill, a cost in labor, a cost in raw materials that someone had to gather, process, and render with their hands. A cost that determined for millions of medieval people across centuries whether they could do any useful work after the sun went down at all. Light in the medieval world was never free. It was made. It was rationed. It was allocated according to social rank with a precision that modern people find genuinely difficult to grasp. And the industry that supplied it, the materials, the labor, the craft of turning animal fat and plant fiber into something that could push back the dark for a few hours, was one of the most essential and most overlooked industries of the entire medieval domestic economy. That is where we are tonight. Let us start with the most basic form of medieval artificial light, because it is the one that almost nobody talks about, and almost everyone who lived through the medieval period would have known intimately. The rushlight, not a candle, not a torch. A rushlight, one of the simplest, cheapest, and most quietly ingenious light sources that human ingenuity has ever produced. The process of making a rushlight began in late summer, when the common rush, the tall, straight-stemmed wetland plant that grew abundantly along rivers and pond edges across northern Europe, reached its mature height. The outer green skin of the rush was peeled away in a single long strip, leaving a thin inner core of white pith intact on just one side of the stem like a narrow ribbon of vegetable tissue running the length of the plant. This peeled rush was then dried carefully, not so much that it became brittle, but enough to reduce its moisture content so that it would absorb fat without steaming or spattering. The dried rushes were then drawn repeatedly through a shallow dish of melted animal fat tallow, rendered from the fat of sheep, cattle, or pigs until the pith had absorbed a sufficient coating. They were laid out to cool and harden, and that was it. A rushlight. The 18th century English naturalist Gilbert White, in his celebrated work called A Natural History of Selborne, described the process of rushlight making in remarkable detail, including a cost calculation that is genuinely startling. He estimated that a family of modest means could produce enough rushlights to supply their entire annual lighting needs for a cost in tallow of roughly 1 shilling and 6 pence at a time, when a skilled agricultural worker might earn 8 or 9p per day. He noted that a single rushlight of good quality, perhaps 8 to 10 in long, would burn for approximately 20 to 25 minutes. 20 minutes per light. Think about how many evenings that represents. How many rushlights a family needed simply to see their way through a single winter's worth of dark evenings. And then think about who made those rush lights, who gathered the rushes, who rendered the tallow, who drew each individual stem through the fat one by one until they were enough to last the season. It was, of course, the women of the household. Now the rushlight was the light of ordinary people, the light of peasant cottages and craftsmen's workshops, and the modest households that made up the vast majority of medieval society. Above the rushlight in the hierarchy of medieval illumination, considerably above in both cost and quality, was the tallow candle. Tallow candles were made from rendered animal fat like rushlights, but in a more structured form. The fat was poured around a wick, typically a length of twisted cotton or plant fiber, either in a mold or by repeated dipping, building up layers of solidified fat around the wick until the candle reached a usable diameter. The quality of a tallow candle depended enormously on the quality of the fat used. Mutton tallow from sheep was considered the best for candle making because it was harder at room temperature than beef or pork fat, which meant it held its shape better and dripped less in use. A well-made mutton tallow candle burned more cleanly and with less smoke than a poorly rendered one, and lasted longer per inch of height. But even the best tallow candle had significant disadvantages by modern standards. It smelled. The smell of burning animal fat is not subtle, and a room lit by several tallow candles had a particular smoky, slightly rancid odor that became the background atmosphere of medieval interiors in the evening hours, and it was relatively dim. A single tallow candle produced perhaps 1 candle power of light, a measurement that exists incidentally because the standard international unit of light intensity was originally defined as the light produced by a specific type of wax candle. 1 candle power enough to see by with difficulty, not enough for fine work without bringing the candle uncomfortably close to whatever you were trying to see. Here's a question I find myself genuinely curious about, and I wonder if you have ever thought about it. How many candles do you think it took to light a medieval great hall adequately for an evening feast? The answer from household accounts that have survived, including the detailed domestic records of several English noble households from the 13th and 14th centuries, is somewhere between 50 and 150 candles, depending on the size of the hall and the occasion. 150 tallow candles burning for an evening, each one made by hand, each one consuming tallow that had to be rendered from animals that had to be raised and slaughtered, each one lasting a few hours at most before guttering out. The wax chandler accounts of the English royal household, preserved in the wardrobe account from the reign of Edward I and Edward II, record candle expenditure at court as one of the significant ongoing costs of the royal domestic establishment. Candles appear as a line item alongside food, clothing, and horses. Light was a budget item in the greatest household in England, and then above the tallow candle at the very summit of the medieval lighting hierarchy was beeswax. Beeswax candles were everything that tallow candles were not. They burned cleanly with almost no smoke. They produced a brighter, steadier, more reliable flame. They had a faint, pleasant, natural fragrance rather than the rancid smell of burning fat. They lasted longer for their size. They did not drip and pool as messily as tallow. They were also dramatically more expensive. Depending on the period and location, beeswax could cost anywhere from 4 to 10 times as much as an equivalent weight of tallow, which meant that beeswax candles in the medieval world were not everyday domestic light. They were luxury light, status light, the light of churches and cathedrals where beeswax was considered the only appropriate offering to illuminate the altar, and where the Catholic Church's long association with beeswax candles gave the beekeeping industry a religious dimension that made it in medieval understanding almost a sacred craft. The light of royal and high noble chambers. The light that you produced when you wanted to signal that money was not a constraint. Medieval sumptive thinking extended to light itself. To burn beeswax in a context where tallow would have served equally well was a statement. A deliberate, legible statement about the resources available to the household making it. And the people who supplied that light, the wax chandlers who worked with beeswax, as distinct from the tallow chandlers who worked with animal fat, occupied distinctly different positions in the guild structure of medieval English towns. Wax chandlers served wealthier clients. They had higher status. Their trade was considered more refined. The hierarchy of medieval society, examined at the level of what kind of fat you burned at night, was remarkably consistent. Let me tell you about something that exists at the intersection of medieval light religion and household economics that I find completely fascinating. The Candlemas calculation. Candlemas, the feast of the presentation of Jesus at the temple celebrated on the 2nd of February, was in the medieval church calendar, one of the major candle feast days of the year. Churchgoers brought candles to be blessed, and the blessing of candles for the year ahead was a significant liturgical event across medieval Europe. But Candlemas had a second meaning in the agricultural and domestic calendar that ran alongside its religious significance. The 2nd of February fell, not coincidentally, at roughly the midpoint of winter. By Candlemas, the darkest months were past. The days were measurably lengthening, and a medieval household that had laden its supply of candles and rushlights in autumn could by Candlemas calculate with reasonable confidence whether its supply would last until the spring days were long enough. That artificial light was no longer needed in the evenings. If the calculation came up short, if the candle supply was going to run out before the light supply of natural days could replace it, the household had a problem. A specific, practical, quantifiable problem that needed to be addressed immediately by rendering more tallow dipping, more candles gathering, and processing more rushes. Candlemas was among other things a domestic accounting moment, a checkpoint in the household's management of its most expensive consumable resource. The religious feast and the practical audit occupied the same day. In the medieval world, the sacred and the domestic were rarely as separate as we tend to imagine them. Now, I want to take you inside the monastery for a moment, because monastic records give us some of the most precise data we have about medieval light consumption. And what they reveal is genuinely illuminating, if you will forgive the pun. Medieval monasteries, which operated on a highly structured schedule of prayers, work, and meals governed by the rule of Saint Benedict and its various derivatives, needed reliable artificial light for their night offices. The divine office required monks to rise in the middle of the night for meteor, the first of the canonical hours, and to chant by the light of whatever their community could afford to provide. The records of English Benedictine monasteries from the 12th through 14th centuries, including the detailed cellars accounts that survive from houses like Peterborough Abbey and Durham Cathedral Priory, record candle allowances with extraordinary specificity. Individual monks were allocated a set number of candles per week for personal use in their cells. The choir was allocated a different quantity for communal offices. The refectory, the infirmary, and the scriptorium each had their own allocations. These allowances were not generous by modern standards. A monk working in a scriptorium copying manuscripts, a task that required both precision and concentration, might be allocated 1 candle per evening of work. 1 candle for several hours of the kind of detailed visual work that we would now consider absolutely impossible without strong, reliable directed light. And yet the manuscripts were produced. The illuminations were painted. The letters were formed with a precision and beauty that still astonishes people who see them today. Produced in the light of a single tallow or beeswax candle, held close to the vellum by monks whose eyes must have ached from the effort. The next time you see a medieval illuminated manuscript in a museum, the gold leaf, the tiny perfect figures, the text as fine and even as any printed page, I want you to think about the light that was made in 1 candle. That is what it took. The making of candles was in households of any size, is itself a significant annual labor event. Candle making in a medieval household typically happened once or twice a year in autumn, when the slaughter of animals provided fresh tallow, and the cold air helped the rendered fat set quickly. It was not an incidental task. It was a dedicated production run. Tallow rendering required cooking the raw animal fat in a large pot over a sustained fire. A hot, smelly, time-consuming process that could take most of a day to process a sufficient quantity of fat for a household's annual needs. The rendered liquid tallow was then strained, cooled to the right temperature, and used for dipping. Dip candles were made by hanging wicks from a rod and lowering them repeatedly into the liquid tallow, dipping, lifting, allowing each layer to cool and solidify before the next dip. A candle of reasonable thickness required 15 to 20 dips. A single rod might hold 20 to 30 wicks simultaneously. The arithmetic of candle production. The number of dips. The number of candles required the quantity of tallow needed. The time involved translated into an entire day, sometimes two of sustained work by the women of the household or by professional chandlers serving multiple households. And at the end of it, they had light, measured ration carefully allocated across the months of darkness ahead. There is a particular detail from a 14th century English household account that I have never been able to get entirely out of my mind. It appears in the domestic records of a moderately prosperous English gentry family, not wealthy by noble standards, but comfortable by the standards of most medieval people. The account records among dozens of other household expenses a purchase of tallow for candle making. The quantity purchased, the price paid, the date, and then a few lines later a separate entry. A small payment to the household senior maidservant for the labor of rendering and dipping that tallow into candles over the course of 2 days. That payment, a few pence, a modest acknowledgement of 2 days' skilled and unpleasant work, is the only record of that woman's existence in the historical archive. We do not know her name. We know she was paid a few pence for 2 days of candle making. We know that the candle she made that autumn probably lit the household's evenings from November through February. We know that without her work, the family sat in the dark, and that is all. She made their light, and history recorded the cost of the tallow. Light in the medieval world was not background. It was not assumed. It was not infrastructure. It was the product of work. Specific skilled seasonal work that required raw materials gathered by hand, rendered by hand, processed by hand, and allocated with the care of any other precious household resource. Every hour of useful evening activity in a medieval home, every garment mended by firelight, every account reviewed by candle, every child's lesson conducted in the thin glow of a rush light, existed because someone had done the work of making that light possible. And that work, like almost all the work we've explored in this journey, was done quietly, without titles, without monuments, without any record beyond the occasional account entry, noting the cost of tallow. We have almost come full circle now. We started this journey beside a hearth, a woman coaxing embers back to life in the dark before anyone else was awake. And here we are near the end talking about light again, about the darkness that medieval households pushed back with tallow and wax and rush, about the labor that made it possible to extend the day by even a few hours into the winter night. There is one final chapter left in this story, the most personal one, the one that asks not just what medieval people did, but what we have lost and what it might mean for us in the world we live in now to understand what they carried. That is part 12, and it is the one I have been thinking about longest. There is a historian whose work I keep returning to whenever I think about questions like the one sitting at the heart of this final chapter. Her name is Ruth Schwartz-Cowan, and in her 1983 book called More Work for Mother, she made an argument that was at the time genuinely provocative and that has in the decades since come to seem more and more obviously correct. Her argument in its simplest form was this: the introduction of labor-saving technology into the home did not reduce the total amount of domestic work that women performed. In many cases, it increased it. The washing machine did not free women from laundry. It raised the standard of cleanliness expected, so that families now wash clothing that would previously have been worn for a week in a single day. The vacuum cleaner did not liberate households from floor care. It made weekly vacuuming an expectation where monthly sweeping had been sufficient before. The technology changed. The labor in many respects did not diminish. It transformed. I want to sit with that idea tonight as we bring this long journey through the medieval home to its close, because I think it tells us something genuinely important not just about history, but about ourselves and about what we carry without knowing we carry it. We have traveled a long way together. We started beside a hearth in January darkness, watching a woman coax embers back to life before her household woke. We moved through the invisible science of cleaning the lye and ash and herbs that kept medieval homes livable. We descended into root cellars packed with salted meat and honey preserved fruit, with vinegar pickled vegetables and fat seal crocks of confit. We walked miles of water, carrying paths worn into the earth by generations of feet. We watched fingers move ceaselessly over spindle and DST and loom. We stood in the physic garden and learned what 7 centuries of observation had taught about healing. We sat beside a household manager, calculating her provisions for the year ahead, negotiating with merchants, supervising a small community of people who depended entirely on her competence. We fought bed bugs and rats and flies, and the ever-present challenge of a home that shared its space with everything that could find a way in. We watched the laundry being beaten on river stones by women whose bones recorded what no document thought to write down. We felt the seasonal turning of a home that breathed with the year rather than against it. And we made light carefully expensively with rendered tallow and bundled rushes, and understood what it meant to ration the hours of your own visibility. 11 chapters of work, 11 windows into a domestic life that history has mostly chosen to look past. And now here we are at the end with the question that has been underneath all of it from the very first chapter. What do we lose when we stop doing all of this? The honest answer is it is complicated. There are things we lost that we should be glad to have lost. The lung damage from smoke-filled hearths, the cracked hands from cold water and caustic lye, the backaches from hauling water mile after mile, the children who died from contaminated wells, the mothers who did not survive the births that medieval midwives could not manage. We should not romanticize the medieval home. I have tried throughout these 12 chapters not to do that, to hold the beauty and the ingenuity of it in one hand, while holding the genuine suffering of it in the other. The suffering was real. The exhaustion was real. The early deaths and the chronic pain and the grinding, relentless demand of it all was real. We escape those things mostly in the parts of the world that have access to clean water and modern medicine and electric light, and washing machines and refrigerators and all the rest of it. And that escape is not nothing. That escape is one of the greatest collective achievements in human history. But there are other things that went with it. Quieter things that we did not notice leaving because they departed so gradually mixed in with so much that we were genuinely glad to be rid of. The first is knowledge of materials. A medieval woman who managed her household knew, in the most intimate physical sense, exactly what everything in her world was made of and where it came from. She knew what it felt like at every stage of its processing, from raw fleece to finished cloth. She knew how different woods burned and what each was good for. She knew which plants healed and which harmed, and how to tell the difference by touch and smell and taste. She knew the soil in her kitchen garden, knew what it needed and what it was capable of producing. She knew the animals she kept, knew their habits and their health and their value. This was not abstract knowledge. It was sensory embodied knowledge that lived in the hands and the nose and the eyes, not just in the mind. We have traded that knowledge for a different kind. We know how to use apps and navigate systems and communicate across distances and process information at speeds that would have seemed supernatural to a medieval person. And those capabilities are genuinely valuable. But we have lost the intimacy with materials that comes from working them with your own hands every day across years. Most of us could not identify the raw fiber that our clothing is made from without reading the label. Could not say whether a piece of wood would burn well or badly, or how long a piece of meat would keep, or which plant in the field beside the road has any useful properties at all. That loss is real. It is not fatal, but it is real. The second thing we lost is something harder to name precisely. Call it the rhythm of necessary work. Medieval domestic life was structured around tasks that had to be done not at any arbitrary time, but in response to real physical, time-sensitive demands. The fire needed attention now, not when it was convenient. The laundry needed to happen on a day the weather permitted. The flax needed to be ratted when the harvest was in, not when someone felt like getting around to it. The candles needed to be made before the darkness came and the supply ran out. These were not self-imposed schedules. They were imposed by the nature of things, by the fire's requirements, and the season's demands and the finite supply of everything essential. And living inside that structure, I think this is the counterintuitive part, gave life a particular kind of clarity that we struggle to replicate in a world where almost nothing is actually urgent in the physical material sense. Modern people, myself included, spend enormous amounts of energy trying to create structure for ourselves. Productivity systems, morning routines, habit stacks, time blocking. We read books about how to organize our days, and we build elaborate frameworks to give ourselves the sense that what we do matters and that our time is shape. Medieval people did not need those systems. The work told them what to do. The season told them when. The fire told them how urgent. There is something I find genuinely appealing about that clarity, even knowing the cost at which it came. The third thing, and the one I want to dwell on longest, because I think it is the one most worth carrying forward, is the visibility of interdependence. A medieval household was a place where the connection between work and survival was direct, legible, and impossible to ignore. When the woman who managed the food stores calculated her family's winter provisions, she could see exactly, not approximately, not theoretically, but exactly the relationship between the work she had done and the family's ability to get through February. When she made the candles, she could hold in her hands the measure of light that those candles would provide, could count the evenings, could feel the weight of the winter's darkness in the quantity of tallow she had or had not rendered. Every task she performed was connected by a chain you could trace with your finger to a specific human need. Warmth, food, light, health, clothing, safety. In our world, most of us cannot see those chains. Our work, most of the time, connects to human need through such a long and complicated series of intermediaries that the connection is invisible. We do our jobs. Money changes, hands, goods, and services flow through systems of such complexity that no individual understands more than their own small piece of it. This is efficient, extraordinarily efficient. The wealth it has generated, the abundance it has created, is genuinely staggering by any historical standard. But something is harder to locate in that efficiency. Something that might be described as the meaning that comes from being able to see clearly and directly that your hands are the reason your family is warm tonight. I want to tell you about a moment that I think captures this better than anything I could construct analytically. There is a record brief embedded in a longer document easy to miss from a 14th century English memorial survey. It describes a particular widow identified only by her first name Beatrice who managed a small holding in a village in Norfolk after her husband's death. The survey notes that she maintained her holding successfully, that her fields were tended, her animals healthy, her rent paid, her household in good order. These were the only criteria the surveyor thought worth recording. But tucked into the margin of the same document in a different hand that appears to be a later edition is a single line that reads translated from the Middle English. Something like she is known in the village for her salted fish, which is the best in the parish. That is all a marginal note. A detail someone thought worth preserving, even though it served no administrative purpose. Beatrix salted fish, the best in the parish. She had a skill that was recognized, a product that people valued, a reputation built on something she had learned to do so well that it stood out even in a community where everyone was doing the same thing. In that one marginal note, you can feel the outline of an entire life. The mornings at the river, the knowledge of brining ratios inherited from her mother, the particular care she brought to the task that lifted her work above ordinary competence into something that her neighbors noticed and remembered. She was not famous. She left no formal record. She had no title and no monument. She had her fish, and her village knew her name. That is the medieval home in the end. Not the kings and the battles and the cathedral stones. The people who got up every morning and did the 1,000 necessary things that made a life possible. The people whose knowledge lived in their hands and their senses and the careful attention they brought day after day to work that the world forgot as soon as it was done. As we come to the end of this journey together, I want to leave you with one thought to carry into whatever comes next for you tonight, whether that is sleep or a few quiet minutes of your own, or the slow drift between waking and dreaming that this kind of hour seems made for. The invisible work of the medieval home was not invisible because it was unimportant. It was invisible because it worked. When the fire burned steadily through the night, no one noticed the woman who had banked it perfectly. When the family ate well through February, no one celebrated the woman who had salted the pork in November. When the children wore clean linen, no one commemorated the laundry day that had cost a full day's brutal work to make it possible. Good domestic management, then, as now, is most visible in its absence. We notice when the heating fails, when the food runs out, when the household falls apart, it seems. We notice the failure, not the 1,000 quiet successes that preceded it. The medieval women whose work we have explored across these 12 chapters were in the truest sense of the word infrastructure, like the pipes beneath the street and the wires inside the wall, essential everywhere and noticed only when something goes wrong. They deserve better than that. They deserve to be noticed while everything was going right. And maybe this is the smallest and most personal hope I have for this series. Maybe knowing their story is one small way of finally doing that. Seeing the work, naming the skill, understanding what it cost, and saying across 8 centuries of silence, we see you, BTR. We see all of you, your fire, your salted fish, your rush light burning in the dark. Thank you. And thank you genuinely warmly with more gratitude than a closing paragraph can quite contain to you for staying with this journey all the way to the end. 12 chapters is a long time to spend in a medieval house. And the fact that you are still here in whatever quiet corner of the world you're occupying right now tells me something I find genuinely moving. That you care about the hidden things, the overlooked things, the stories that history walked past without stopping. That is exactly the kind of curiosity I am here to feed. If this journey gave you something, a detail that surprised you a moment, that made you pause a new way of looking at the ordinary things in your own home, I would love to know. Drop in the comments. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me which chapter made you think of something in your own life. Your own grandmother's kitchen. Your own hands doing some small necessary thing. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do, because the next story is already waiting. A different time, a different world, but the same spirit, the hidden history, the overlooked people, the work that kept everything running while everyone else was looking somewhere else. That story is coming soon, and I think it just might keep you up a little past your bedtime. Sleep well, friend.